Hello, everyone, brothers, sisters, comrades, friends. Welcome to the People's Forum for a really fantastic afternoon of important discussion, conversation on the crisis, the conflict in the Horn of Africa, imperialism, Ethiopia, and all of that you're here for today. So thank you for immediately quieting down. I was like, okay, let me get my little spiel, and everyone got it together. We appreciate it. All right, so we're gonna get right into it. Welcome again, everyone here. This event is co-sponsored by the Answer Coalition, by the New Afrika Institute, and by our gracious host here at the People's Forum, this beautiful space. We are always happy to be here in conversation, in movement, and in building. So I'm actually going to give it up to Claudia de la Cruz, the Executive Director of the People's Forum, to give us a more formal welcome to this beautiful space.
How's everybody doing? Good? Well, you look good from up here. I'm glad to be here with y'all. As Monica said, my name is Claudia de la Cruz. I'm a co-executive director of the People's Forum. How many of you been in the People's Forum before? Okay. Well, it's good to have you back. And those of you who haven't been here, welcome to the People's Forum. The People's Forum is a space for political education, for culture, and connecting struggles. And for us to be able to have this conversation on what's happening in the Horn of Africa is very important for different reasons. It's important because we claim to be and behave as such as an anti-imperialist space, as a space that is anti-patriarchal and is anti-capitalist. That's a lot of antis, right? But we're also pro the development of a society that is free to create a world that stands for the working class and for the poor and the most marginalized in history, which is very different from what capitalism is and what imperialism has done. And the level of atrocities that we could count in Africa have had a result as such because of imperialism, because of colonialism. And so we want to be able to understand not only what's happening in Ethiopia today, but what's happening in the continent of Africa and why it's happening. And we also want to be able to claim a certain level of responsibility as we live and exist in the belly of the beast. The United States, which has had its agenda spread throughout the world for the purpose of controlling, for the purpose of exploiting, for the purpose of extracting. And so for us, it's very important to hold this event. We've been getting a lot of trolling on the internet, and we're happy to get that level of trolling because that means that we're doing something right. And so we want to continue to do this work, and we want to continue to build bridges, and we want to continue to deepen the understanding of our people on the impact of colonialism, of capitalism, of imperialism, not for the purpose of accumulating knowledge, but for the purpose of intervening the way we should politically and socially in our communities. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the New Afrika Institute and the Answer Coalition for bringing us into the fold of this event, and we hope to continue to build with you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for really just setting the stage for what this event is about and so much of the work that goes on here at the People's Forum. Again, we are so grateful to have a space like this in the belly of the beast in New York City, the center of global capital. And I was remiss to introduce myself. My name is Monica Cruz, and I'm an organizer with the Answer Coalition, that is the Act Now to Stop War and Racism Coalition. We are the largest anti-war organization in the country, and again, so important we feel it is to be here today. So while the conflict in Ethiopia has been in the news, the facts remain heavily obscured. One-sided narratives and decontextualized conversation have been the hallmark of what has been presented by the mainstream media. This afternoon, we aim to get behind the headlines and give the correct context and the facts that may prove inconvenient to the powers that be, particularly in the power centers of Washington, D.C. The Horn of Africa is one of the most geostrategic regions in the earth. It sits at the crossroads of world commerce and for literally centuries has been a meeting point for many of the world's major cultures. It has some of the world's most important historical sites and contains critical history and sites for several of the world's major religions. Events there have reverberations across the globe, even if many in the West can be unaware of this. And for anti-war and pro-peace forces here in the United States, a proper understanding of events in the region are crucial to understanding the impact this government has on world events. We're honored to have here today a panel of speakers to address many of these issues and more. We have Eugene Puryear with the Answer Coalition, Mohammed Hassan, Elias Amare here joining us on Zoom, and Simon Tesfamariam also here with us in person. We'll have our speakers each give a 10-minute opening presentation, then open the floor up for questions and comments. And those questions and comments, or questions in particular, can be taken in person, and I'll also be scrolling through our social media pages to check for any questions there. So first, we'll start off with Eugene Puryear, an organizer with the Answer Coalition.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Monica. I really appreciate it. Monica's been working all night and all day on a number of different events, so thank you so much for being with us here. And of course, thank you to the People's Forum for hosting us here this afternoon, the New Afrika Institute, and to everyone who is present either here in person or vis-a-vis our live stream. We thank you so much for being a part of this event. And just to speak and make a few points, and I'll try to speak relatively briefly, and of course in our question and answer we can say more, but I wanted to say something about why really it was important for us as the Answer Coalition to do this event and why it's relevant for us. And I think that because the conflict happening in the Horn, and certainly in Ethiopia in particular, to me is an object lesson in the uses and abuses, if you will, of U.S. foreign policy, and really I think a very good window into why some of us say that U.S. foreign policy is imperialist. It's an imperialist foreign policy. It's a policy of empire, which I know sometimes can sound like sloganeering. And when we talk about the conflict in Ethiopia in particular, and I know that certainly for many of us who are here, certainly for those of us who are active online, the narrative war has been such a big part of this. What's really happening, what's not really happening, who has the authority to speak, who doesn't have the authority to speak. And I think the truth and facts of any particular incident are extraordinarily important. But I also think there's another element to it, even in terms of the framing of how things are discussed, that play a very important role in how we consider this. Because when it becomes just sort of a competition over, who is the worst in the context of things that are happening, the one thing that it immediately does is it obscures the politics. And I think that's super important, because as it's been said many times, war is hell. I mean, we can look through all wars throughout history, and it would be very difficult for us to find one where the conditions are less than ideal. But I think what many of us feel, certainly what we feel at the Answer Coalition, is that, in certain cases, they do happen. So a question becomes not who's the best and who's the worst, but what are the motives behind the different forces that are at play? What's really going on in terms of the broader tectonic plates and politics are behind it, and what does that mean the outcome potentially could be of a contest between two particular forces, and is that good and is that bad? And I think the one thing that you have in terms of where things are focused now, and I think this is why in many ways there's such an acute and aggressive attempt to create so much falsehood in terms of what's happening, so much distortion in terms of what's happening, because then you sort of get off the main point and you start having a back and forth over important issues. And I want to circle back around to that, and I don't want to say the truth or falsity of anything is unimportant, but I do think the framing of how the conversation takes place is crucially important to think about, and that's really what I want to get to here today. Because when we think about the concept of the narrative war that is taking place right now, I mean, it's the level of hypocrisy can oftentimes just be breathtaking. I mean, here we are talking about Ethiopia and Eritrea today, and of course the US government and many others in the Western sphere have been making a very large deal about humanitarian crises. But right there in Yemen, right now, the world's worst humanitarian crisis is being carried out by one of the US's closest allies in Saudi Arabia. So I have to ask, why are they not sanctioning Saudi Arabia? Why are they not threatening Saudi Arabia with pulling out of trade deals the same way they do to Ethiopia? Why are they not pushing the same level of aggressiveness in terms of demonization? And of course, the media follows behind that on so many different levels. And I mean, you know, we'll find out, I guess, historically 20 years from now how closely they're really following it. But I think you can just see right there the double standards and the hypocrisy that are present just in the region alone. But, you know, we could say this in many other contexts. I mean, certainly, you know, we're talking about the Gulf. We could say it in the context of forced labor. The United States has a lot to say about forced labor in China, but the Gulf is built on forced labor. They have nothing to say there. They're not sanctioning Qatar. And the New York Times isn't writing articles like Declan Walsh did about Ethiopia. You know, they're writing articles about how great Qatar is, even though people who are coming from other countries there to work are in indentured servitude. So again, you can see it. And obviously, it's very operative with Ethiopia. I mean, for 30 years, the United States was very close to the TPLF. People here may remember in 2012 when Obama went to Ethiopia, and it was a big deal, and he said, even though people were saying, don't go, there are all these terrible things happening, he goes and he says, this is a democracy. This is a beacon of democracy for the African continent, despite the fact that the TPLF is certainly guilty of, has been accused of, however you want to frame it, the exact same things that the US government is saying, oh, well, they're doing this now, and this is totally unacceptable. So what's the difference? Well, the obvious difference is great power politics. Whether we're talking about Yemen, whether we're talking about China, whether we're talking about the Horn of Africa, whatever is deemed to be happening is only bad or unacceptable to the US government to the extent that those who they claim to be carrying something out are outside of the agenda in the region. As long as you're with the US agenda in the region, it's all fine. And as soon as you break from it, then they look for everything true or false in order to be able to demonize you and to create a different reality. And I think what that really shows us is that US foreign policy, and this is why we call it imperial, is absolutely and completely incompatible with national sovereignty, national independence, or self-determination. It can't be done. You can do anything as long as you don't buck US policy. And if you do, you can do nothing. It has, I mean, look around the world, whether you're socialist, whether you're capitalist, whether you're an Islamic government, a Christian one, a secular one, the ones that are against the US government, they are targeted, they are sanctioned, they are starved, and those who are alongside of it, every crime conceivably is not only excused, but often pushed forward, which, you know, of course is the case with what we said there in Yemen. And excuse me for, you know, checking my notes here. I guess I should have had some nicer piece of paper, but here it is, 2021. And you know, what I really want to sort of start to come to a close with here, I have no idea how long I've been talking, so I want to try to stick to the piece. Thank you, I'm all right, thank you, Monica. Is to close a little bit talking about a few different things that I think are interrelated. And you know, one, of course, being what is really motivating the US foreign policy in the region, at least from our point of view. And I think on top of that, how that intersects with some of the other issues that we've been discussing, or some of us have been discussing here for some time, as it regards what's being said and how it's being said. But I think when we look at the US policy as it concerns Ethiopia, we have to really look in two directions in terms of what I think is really behind it. One, of course, is the Grand Renaissance Dam, and the other being the unity between Ethiopia and Eritrea after the peace deal. And I think when you look at those two things, it starts to make a lot of sense. Now, again, of course, we have mentioned this, and I think we'll mention this throughout all of our talks. I mean, and I think for many people it's clear, especially those who are from the region. I think from the United States, people in the United States, it's often not clear that the Horn of Africa is as strategic as it is, because Africa as a continent, of course, is just completely and totally wiped out of the historical and contemporary knowledge of what is going on. But all you really have to think about, if you are somewhat curious, is when that ship got stuck in the Suez Canal. People remember the ship getting stuck in the Suez Canal. We're laughing about it now, but obviously it was serious. But nevertheless, you can see that it was such a big deal because a significant part of global commerce was held up by the blockage of this Suez Canal. Like tens of billions of dollars are being lost in countries all around the globe every single day that that ship was stuck. So it gives you a sense when you think about sort of the crossroads of the world element that Monica mentioned. I mean, not only do you have the huge flow of global commerce coming there through the Suez Canal, and then through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean, but you also have then sort of that crossroads of the world between the East and the West, as it's quote unquote called, and of course with so much of the economy shifting into Asia, it becomes even more globally important. And so the issues of who's who and what's what and who's in charge and who isn't is critically important. But I will say on the Ethiopia issue and on the dam issue, on the dam issue and the Egypt issue, I think that really has a slightly separate motivation, but I do think it's critically important. Because when you look at when Donald Trump said, okay, well, we want to negotiate between Ethiopia and Sudan and Egypt, but then took Egypt's position 110%, which I think many people were surprised about. Well, what was also happening at the same time? Well, the United States was bringing Sudan into the imperial architecture in terms of supporting their writ in the Middle East, opening up and normalizing relations with Israel, and obviously Egypt, we know the role that they play as essentially an adjunct for crushing the Palestinian people, keeping Gaza locked in a cage, the world's largest outdoor prison. And so all of a sudden you have a conflict between two countries that are crucially important for the United States because the US is pivoting to Asia. And so ultimately, they're trying to disengage to some degree militarily from the Middle East. So the importance of the proxy states in the region becomes critically important to prevent the thing that they don't want to happen, which is for Iran to have any influence in the region whatsoever, regardless of what the people in the region want. And thus, Egypt and Sudan become absolutely more critical. Ethiopia becomes problematic because they're starting to do something that may in fact upset the balance of the region. And then secondarily, and this speaks to the geopolitical point, maybe I should have said this first, is the unity between Ethiopia and Eritrea. I think we can go back decades. This is one of the things that the United States and the West fears the most. I mean, if you look at US foreign policy in the Horn, one thing you can say is it usually is around the issue of disunity. I mean, certainly if we're talking contemporarily, look at what's happening in Somalia. Why was it that the TPLF-led Ethiopian regime and the United States were hand in glove together to destabilize Somalia? Well, I mean, it couldn't have been the Islamic Courts Union was the worst of the worst because, you know, half of them became the transitional federal government. But some of them, they felt we couldn't trust them. You can't have someone in a geostrategic region that you can't trust. We know that Eritrea and the United States have been deeply at odds, that the United States has demonized Eritrea for years. To have Eritrea and Ethiopia coming together, to have the possibility of more unity with Somalia, that, I believe, is something that is deeply worrisome to them. The idea that in one of the most geostrategic regions on Earth, you would have a situation where you'd have an independent state. And this is, I think, when I say it doesn't comport with national independence, you don't even have to be hostile to the United States. You could want to have good relations. But if you decide you will not be dictated to, and of course, we know the rise of China is also crucially important to give people leverage so that they don't have to be dictated to, then it becomes problematic. So I'll just close by saying this. I think that when you put those sort of two pieces together, a lot of things make sense, and the narrative war starts to make a lot of sense. Because ultimately, if you want to pursue a policy that is going to promote war, promote disunity, promote destabilization, the one thing you definitely cannot have widely known is the truth. And forget even the truth, you can't even have a complicated reality at all. You have to have a one-sided story. And so that's why, I mean, how can you have a situation, I mean, it's really amazing when you think about it, that you can say, okay, well, one side is doing X, Y, Z. The same organizations can say, well, actually, the other side is now doing X, Y, Z. But only one story goes viral and gets on the front page of the New York Times and goes all over the world and has the BBC and all of their journalists backing it up. I mean, that's an unbelievable statement, one, about the relationship of the media to imperial power in the United States and other parts of the West. But I think it's a powerful statement about what's really going on. Why is it important to have this narrative? I mean, if the cause is just, if I'm the US government and I say I'm supporting the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front or their ridiculously misnamed Tigrayan Defense Forces. If they are just, why is it problematic for me to admit what's really happening, to have an even-handed perspective, to say what's going on? Because if I feel I'm right, then of course you can always admit, you know, we all make mistakes. So if I'm in the right, but I can admit I made a little mistake. So if all of a sudden you're saying, well, nothing bad is happening whatsoever, everything is good, it's only one side, that's a sign that you're trying to create a narrative to forward a political goal. And I think going back to the issue of the framing, that's why the issue of how the conversation is framed is important, because where they're going to take it. Because the reality is this. When it becomes one side is committing genocide and the other side is the victim of genocide, then only two things really become possible from a foreign policy point: sanctions and intervention. And certainly we know the reality of sanctions, no matter what they say, no matter how targeted they say they are, they only hurt the people. Look at Venezuela, look at Iran, look at Cuba, you can see it right now. And certainly the interventions, we have to look no further than Libya, from Syria, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, that they've just completely destroyed all of these countries and many of the neighboring countries. But that really becomes the only thing, because you raise the level of crime to genocide, you've created a perspective where people don't want to question it. And they're like, well, we got to do something because this is so bad. bad. So that, I think, is really the nature of why this has been so outlandish and so over the top and so myopic in terms of what's actually going on, is that there's a deeper hidden goal that is behind this. And I think that really, for those of us especially who are living in the United States, is really the upshot of the entire thing, is that the US government reserves the right to determine for every other country what kind of government they have, what kind of economic policy they have, what they can do, where they can go, what the regional relations between countries can be, what the internal balance of power can be. And of course, for years in the region, the TPLF was willing to go along with that narrative. Because of their own brutality, they were sidelined in their own coalition, and they decided to launch a war in order to reinsert themselves into the political agenda. And I think that's why the United States has jumped on the bandwagon, because they've seen a great opportunity to use this insurgent conflict in order to leverage more support inside of the Ethiopian government, and because of the weight of Ethiopia, inside of the Horn, to determine the direction of the politics. And I think that that is 100% incorrect, 100% wrong, exactly what's wrong with US foreign policy, that is designed to coerce other nations to do whatever they want to do. And I think we should use this as a turning point moment, in my view, to talk more about the role of the US and the West on the African continent more generally, whether we're talking about in West Africa, with what we see with French in the United States and also the Germans, what we're now seeing in Southern Africa with the Italians, using ISIS as a threat to promote intervention in Mozambique, also in the DRC, US Special Forces in Ghana, bases being built in Niger. I think this is all part of one piece, because Africa is the richest, youngest continent with the most potential to make a huge impact in the 21st century that could drive the direction of the world in a very different way. They want to stop that. They want to shut that down. I think that's deeply, deeply problematic. I think the US has no right to do that. And I think that's why, among other reasons, this is a really important conflict, I think, even for people who feel a little far away from it, to understand what's going on, and I think to take action against the unbelievable unilateral one-sided approach of the US government. So I'll just end there. I'm sorry if that took too long. I'm looking forward to hearing what other folks have to say, and also having a bit of a dialogue here this evening. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Eugene. Next, we will have via Zoom or whatever video conferencing software you're using today, we will have Dr. Mohammed Hassan join us, a former Ethiopian diplomat who resigned in protest of the TPLF's various crimes, who is also a longtime struggler on many fronts. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much. Understanding is forces always narrative. Narrative is very, very difficult to understand. Very difficult to understand for the ordinary people. Narrative, most of cases, have no reality on the ground. Wishful thinking. And the basis on that, try to mobilize and confuse all people and the American people. Beginning. Finally, when things are getting very bad and negative for them, some elements up the narrative. Horn of Africa, the last 6 decades, 7 decades, United States built several narratives on the contradiction of the Horn of Africa, particularly different forces who are struggling with the Eritrean revolution since 1970. Other forces also in Ethiopia and in the region painted it in a way as if it is one time is a Muslim-Christian contradiction in the region. The other moment it is African contradictions, mobilize a segment of innocent Africans, the basis of racism, in fact. Africans can see the Eritrean revolution and the Eritrean struggle. It is a struggle between who wants to be Arab and those who doesn't want to be Arab. It is a false narrative. I never mentioned the right of Eritrean people for self-determination. The US who have engineered false federation by force, the right of self-determination of Eritrean. Suppose if that had been accepted, the relationship between Ethiopia, probably of the region, had been totally different. They have a narrative and contradiction every time to maintain their hegemony.
I don't know.
History goes further.
I'm not sure if he can hear me. Oh, I'm so sorry to interrupt Dr. Hassan, but we're going to ask you to pause while we figure out this sound issue that we're having. Your sound is coming kind of in and out, so we're missing every few words that you're saying. So just give us one moment. Thank you so much. We'll let you know. So.
I think it is from the... Now do you hear me good?
It sounds a lot clearer.
It is better?
Yes, yes, much better. Thank you.
Yes. I don't know. It is a Japanese mic I have, but it doesn't like me probably. I will speak without a mic. What I wanted to say is that it is... I wanted to explain the narrative of the United States, the three narratives they have promoted in history in the last 100 years. United States is a young imperialist force, was looking at a place within the African continent, while Europe was dominating the whole continent of Africa, particularly Britain and France. And these two, they even went to war in Fashoda. And then later on, they have to agree somewhere a gentleman agreement to protect sphere of influence. In that agreement that the Horn of Africa was designed in such a way that it is the two imperialist forces, Great Britain and France, they needed an airbag among themselves, that they don't go direct into contradiction and war. And they promoted the recently unified young Italian state from 1863, and immediately after a few years it became a colonialist country subsidized by Great Britain. This is the geopolitics of the bigger imperialist forces. And the second is United States was looking to the African continent, and there was no place for United States to have any access inside African continent. A young, clever diplomat, an American, Sinclair, also a spy, appointed in France, in Marseille, and his job was to check what the goods who have been looted from the African continent, which is coming to the French harbor, Marseille. And he used to write a lot of letters to the head of states of United States. He is telling them that it is this African continent, this dark continent is looted by European gangs. American firms have no possibility to enter. He says they control it like a gulag. There is no way we Americans, we can do business. And finally, he says that there is a possibility that the Americans can make a stepping stone. Abyssinia, he said. Abyssinia is a semi-colony. There is a prince who was surrounded by the French and the Italians and the British. If we can penetrate and try to bring him to our side, we can use this semi-colony or semi-independent state, Abyssinia, later on which became Ethiopia,
as a stepping stone to penetrate in the African continent. Finally, this man, they asked him, what do you want to do? How can we penetrate? Then he came for the first time to Aden. He established his diplomatic office there. American consulate was established in Aden. And after that, he came to Ethiopia and he established his relationship, which is not Ethiopia, Abyssinia by that moment. In 1903, United States had a diplomatic relationship with Ethiopia. The purpose was to penetrate the African continent using Ethiopia or Abyssinia as a stepping stone. And that was the US policy until the Second World War, and then finally the Cold War. And of course, in this policy, you have to create a narrative to dehumanize and negate the Eritrean issue. That it is, you have to confuse the Africans, you have to confuse the Ethiopians if it is possible, but promote your own interest. And in that sense that it is, John Forster Dulles himself is saying, from a legal point of view and from the point of view of justice, the Eritrean people have the right to have the right of self-determination. But from our interest point of view, he said, that Eritrean people have no right. It have to be federated by force with our friend Ethiopia, which is a feudal state, and they engineered the marriage between a rat and elephant. This is the US policy, the biggest mistake that prolonged the war between my country and the people of Eritrea. But this struggle continued for the last 60 years, and for the first 30 years, that the Eritrean revolution got mature and having a mature leadership, being an independent based on self-reliance. The Eritrean revolution is based on 4 important cardinal principles. 1, they have no complex, they can deal with everybody, they can work with everybody, provided that any friend and any supporter who wants to come and to aid and to support the Eritrean revolution should not intervene in the cardinal principle of the Eritrean revolution, and that is the self-reliance, the concept of the Eritrean revolution. Second, they have a great patience. They are not in a hurry to win militarily and to win the independence very quick. In the process, that they were also building an embryo nation formation to show the narrative of the US and the imperialist countries have engineered, telling that the Eritrean people are divided on the basis of languages, the Eritrean people are divided on the basis of religion and so on, Libanizing the Eritrean issue in a fake narrative. They were building a new nation within a nation through the struggle. These also have to be crushed, but they didn't succeed on that. The third major element is that the Eritrean revolution had also a boomerang effect in the region, which have a vision that it is, this contradiction is not a contradiction of the people of the region. There is no geographical change will happen. We can build a new relationship on the new basis if we all of us are being liberated and we become sovereign and work together shoulder to shoulder and build the situation of our people into a better condition. This part, it really frightens the imperialists, that they wanted the war to continue, the conflict to continue for a very long time. And in that way, they want to create a crisis and manage it and create also a different theories and so on. So they wrote a lot of books about the region. Big part of it is a garbage. It doesn't represent the population of the region. It doesn't look to the history of the region by just supporting, so-called supporting one group, one elite group of one part in order to continue and to dominate. The purpose of the Horn of Africa for them is a military base. From there, they can strengthen their strategical base to control, especially after several changes happen in the Arab world, that it is to limit the revolutionary movement in the Arab world. And of course, the United States squandered whatever she had in the Vietnam and other wars and so on. And it became totally dependent. Today, the dollar, it became an international currency, not because of the American economy, it's because the Arab oil is sold in dollar. That is simple as that. Imagine if the oil is not sold in dollar, and dollar could have collapsed. And secondly, of course, they wanted to use the Horn of Africa as a military base, as an intervention base. Beyond that, also to take the resources and so on. So the narrative is the US had a very good experience in its own history, particularly when they were fighting against the indigenous Indians. The tactic they have used to eliminate the indigenous Indians by using one Indian people against the other. After they eliminate them, of course, they gave their names to their helicopters, Apache, or they gave to their cars that they produced, the Mustang, and so on. United States had a very good experience of dividing and using, and that policy was, they wanted to use it in the Horn of Africa. Unfortunately, the consciousness of the people of the Horn of Africa have risen after all the difficulties and the misery they had. And now the new situation, 2018, it brought in front of them a new element which they couldn't understand, that it is the antagonism between Ethiopia and Eritrea cannot continue for a very long time, and that the new young prime minister, he walked in and he went to Eritrea and he accepted the peace, and he said, we are going to start a new chapter among us. We are brothers and sisters. We will work together shoulder to shoulder. In this sense that it is the US imperialism panicked and now needed the old servant of them, TPLF, which have run away to Tigray, to revive and to give it an oxygen in order to disturb the region. And they continue the narrative as if they are the brothers and the friends of the people of Tigray. I don't believe American imperialism really love the people of Tigray. We love the people of Tigray. They are our brothers and sisters. They are the ones who are living in the region. They are suffering. You should go and visit Tigray. Even the capital, Mekelle, there is not even a drinking water. These small minority thugs who have stolen the property of Ethiopian people created a very difficult situation to the people in the Horn of Africa, used later on to intervene in Somalia, killed about 16,000 Somalis, and then been defeated and thrown away. Now, the Horn of Africa constitutes a very strategic, in a sense, it is human potential. At the same time, its resources is very huge. The global situation is changing very rapidly toward Asia. The Horn of Africa is part of the big rivers connected to the Indian Ocean. So that is why now they want to choke the coming other force which is contending them. And they read, and the reading of China they have also is very, very negative. And they wanted to disturb the Horn of Africa. To conclude, the late Professor Chalmers Johnson, who was a specialist on China and Japan, he passed away in 2012. He was one of the die-hard American who supported the CIA. He was against the student movement in 1968, and he's a specialist on China. His PhD dissertation, which is published later on as a book, this he have to say. He says, why the communists won in China? I really advise anybody in the United States to find this book and to read it. He says that the communists won because of the brutal intervention of Japanese imperialism. It awakened the sleeping Chinese peasant to be a nationalist and patriot against external intervention. And this have transformed China to a modern situation, despite the huge losses they did. Second, this is my observation, when the small man Deng Xiaoping, when he said that I don't care whether the cat is black or red, as long as it catches the rat, the US and the US ruling class and firms understood it wrongly. He was not writing to the Western countries. He was writing to the overseas Chinese. The overseas Chinese, they constitute 55 million. They dominate Indonesia, they dominate Malaysia, they dominate Cambodia, they have dominated the Philippines, they dominated even Vietnam before they were chased away. They dominate until today Thailand, and the capital they have in their hand is as big as German capital. He wanted that these capitalists, Chinese capitalists, who are overseas Chinese, to come to invest in China. But of course, the greedy imperialist Western firms, they rush over there. And of course, Chinese have prepared the ground, and gradually they have reached where they are. Now, to make my story short, I think their reading about us is wrong. Their reading is an Eurocentric reading, a colonialist reading, and they assume that we are stagnated somewhere before Buddha. We cannot reason, we cannot understand what the imperialists and the other forces they want from us, and so on. And these young people, which you see, studied in the different American universities, employed in the different American establishments, particularly the State Department and the CIA and so on, these are young people born in villages. America is, a big part of it is a village society, except very few cities and little bit there and there universities. Their understanding of the world is very, very poor and very shallow. And they assume and they wanted to promote themselves. They make terrorism of intellectuals and so on us. But I really assure you, that is not possible. That time is gone. And we are not against the American people. We can work with them, provided that it is a paternal, brotherly relationship. But it is that situation of 80 years ago, 90 years ago, it is not there. 70% of the population of the Horn of Africa are younger than 40 years old. They are no more like their grandfathers and grandmothers. They can understand things, and it will be very, very difficult that it is to disorganize them and to divide them. Of course, they have the neo-colonial bourgeoisie there and there who have adapted and grow up and incubated by external forces. These ones, they might work with them, but I think the masses, the majority of the population in Ethiopia, in Eritrea, in Somalia, I think they are getting aware, and their consciousness, it became wider and wider. Urbanization have increased. The level of education have multiplied more than 100%, and so on and so on. It will be very difficult to, you might confuse my father, you might confuse my grandfather, but it is very difficult to confuse and to cheat Mr. Simon, the one who is sitting near to you. He's 70% of the population are his age. So that is my understanding. If we wanted to promote a solidarity, our strategy must be the victims are both. There are victims in the United States who have no possibility to understand this complicated situation. We have to raise and debate with them, not to fly above them, to explain to them what is Horn of Africa. Is it there are people there are living, or a very few giraffe or elephant are living? How many is their number? How many languages they speak? What is their culture? What is their psychology? The interlinking of the people of the Horn of Africa, whether it is in a cultural side, and the psychological side, linguistic side, and so on and so on. This we have to try to explain. At the same time, we have to promote that it is not every American is against our dream. Americans themselves, they are victims in their own country. They want also a dream for themselves in America. And as we are, we want also a dream for our brothers and sisters in Ethiopia, in the Horn of Africa. Therefore, is the narratives. We have to combat the false narrative which they fabricate in their own factories, and they employ some charlatan journalists and charlatan intellectuals who come with a tie and who can explain very goodly, but in reality they don't understand the region, and some of them even they have never been. I really advise you, go to the State Department and go to the Department of Africa and see, to differentiate the Department of Asia, particularly Middle East Department. And you see the African continent, there is about 54 countries. And that 54 countries, that what they call the Africa Department, there is not even 6 people are working there. 4 of them are considered the diplomats. The other 2 are maybe ladies who are cleaning and bringing the coffee. And from there, they are cooking it. When you go to the Middle East Department, you'll get surprised. The Arabic speakers, those who have been trained very extensively in expensive schools in the past in Egypt, in Syria, and so on, you will get surprised. Please go to the restaurant and go and have a lunch there and try to discover the difference. And then you see where is United States policy lies and what they wanted to dominate and how they connect the Horn of Africa with the Middle East very easily. You don't have to go to university to understand that. Just visit that place and make a tourist organization for the ordinary workers in the United States to visit the State Department. Then they will understand the balance of forces of American policy outside the United States. Thank you very much.
Elias Amare, a longtime Eritrean revolutionary, to come and speak and join us on video.
Well, thank you very much, dear comrades and friends, brothers and sisters. It's a great privilege and honor for me to join with you in New York via the wonders of technology, Zoom. I'm hoping that the audience, us in the panel, is mostly a young crowd. So that makes me and my good friend and comrade, Ustaz Muhammad Hassan, as the elders here. I can say past the 6 decades mark. Muhammad may be a bit older than me, maybe 2, 3 years, but we are of the same age group. So it's always a pleasure to talk with the youth, because that is where our hope lies. That's where our optimism of the will that keeps us going in a struggle, that keeps us saying, "A luta continua," no matter what, you know, despite the pessimism of the intellect and what have you. So I'm a bit at a disadvantage coming after my eloquent friend and mentor, Muhammad Hassan, because he said a lot of the things I wanted to say. I prepared the text, so I'm going to put aside the prepared text and just try to make it plain and focus on the major points. You have put forth in the beginning imperialism, so it's important for us to understand what is imperialism and imperialism in the Horn of Africa, and to try to contextualize the history. To paraphrase someone, some people in the Horn of Africa, the youth who have come of age the past 30 years, say, well, why are you talking about imperialism? You know, we tone it down. You know, we don't want to rouse the beast. You know, or try to use some euphemism. Well, to those I say, you may not be interested in imperialism, but imperialism is very much interested in you and is constantly interfering in your in your history, in your daily life. So it is incumbent upon us to understand the nature of the beast, to understand what imperialism is and how imperialism has been operating in the Horn of Africa. Well, if we understand by imperialism to mean as the highest stage of capitalism, the era of monopoly capitalism, it began with the late 19th century, right? Right around the same time of the scramble for Africa, the Berlin Conference 1885. That's when imperialism starts. And that's when imperialism, to paraphrase Malcolm X, landed on us like the Plymouth Rock landed on African Americans. Malcolm X famously says, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. Plymouth Rock landed on us, right? The tragedy of imperialism landed on us in the Horn of Africa with the scramble of Africa, for Africa, Berlin Conference, and our part of the world, the Horn of Africa, I must say, was a fierce arena of contest. The natives resisted fiercely, fought bloody wars in the Sudan. The Mahdi fought, defeated the British first, but later they came back with great force and defeated him. In Eritrea, there was a fierce resistance to Italian colonization at first, but it was unfortunately crushed. But at least in Eritrea, the Italians had a plan to have settler colonialism like the French in Algeria or the British in Kenya and Zimbabwe. But when they saw the fierce resistance of the natives, they canceled that settler colonialism plan and went to plan B. We tried to invade Ethiopia, 1896, fierce resistance in Adwa. One of the great anti-colonial victories, that is the pride of Africa. In Somalia, well, the so-called Mad Mullah, forget the name, Sheikh Muhammad Abdullahi, am I right, my friend Muhammad? Fierce resistance there, fought for 2 decades, and the British tried to demonize him, because demonization didn't start now. When they try to, we Eritreans sometimes say President Isaias Afwerki is the most demonized African leader. Hey, but demonization did not start at present. It started then. They called him the Mad Mullah to demonize him. So what I'm saying is, when imperialism set its foot in the Horn of Africa, it faced fierce resistance. And to this day also, it continues to face fierce resistance. And that's a source of hope for us, continue the struggle. The nature of imperialism, secondly, is to intervene constantly. It is in the nature of the beast. That's its nature. It has to intervene. These days, we hear a lot about R2P, responsibility to protect, and humanitarian intervention. Well, these are not new concepts. Imperialism at first, when it came to Africa, also came with a sort of humanitarian intervention, but it had a different name for it: civilizing mission, or the white man's burden, to use that infamous Kipling's term. So the more things that change, the more they remain the same in the Horn of Africa. So this is the broad overview of imperialism. But when we are talking about imperialism in the modern sense after the end of the Second World War, I would like to mention also a historical event of significance. One in 1945, then President of the United States, FDR, Roosevelt, came from the Yalta Conference, where they had a Yalta Conference with Stalin, Churchill, you remember? He came by ship and came to Suez Canal. There he summoned three leaders, three emerging leaders of that neighborhood of ours. One was King Abdulaziz of Saudi Arabia. The second was the Egyptian King Farouk. The third was Emperor Haile Selassie. These were to be the anchor states for imperialism to control that region. So ever since then, the fate of Eritrea was sealed. It had to be annexed to Ethiopia. And of course, the Eritrean people fought fiercely, eventually achieved independence in 1991. So this intervention that started right in 1945 continued for the next 80 years up to the present. During the Cold War, the Horn of Africa was a fierce arena of contest between the two superpowers. In fact, it's funny that they played musical chairs there. At one time, the US was the patron of Ethiopia under Emperor Haile Selassie, and the Soviets were, allied with Somalia and at times with Sudan. And then they changed position, and the US became the patron of Somalia, and the Soviets became the patrons of the Derg in Ethiopia. We had that kind of weird musical chair play of the great power. So the Horn of Africa, we must remember, continues to be to this day the arena of context and great interference of great powers, more so than anywhere else in the African continent. Why is this so? Well, a good friend, young comrade Eugene, beautifully highlighted it in the beginning, the opening remarks, and Professor Mohammed also did so. But the Horn of Africa, we have to see it as a region of the confluence of multiple regions. First of all, the Horn of Africa, when we talk about it, strictly speaking, is composed of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Somalia. Strictly speaking, this is the Horn of Africa. But sometimes they speak about greater Horn of Africa to include Kenya, Uganda, South Sudan, and Sudan. But this region is also, it overlaps into the Nile Basin region, which then includes Egypt. And the Nile is important, as has been mentioned. The GERD issue, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, is hot now, and that includes Egypt. And Egypt is also an anchor state for the United States. It has been so ever since the coming of Sadat, after Nasser, anyway. So that is another important region to look at. When we talk about the Horn of Africa, it overlaps, and issues of the Nile Basin are important. Ethiopia also, which is at the center of the Horn of Africa, is the water tower of the Nile Basin. The high mountains of Ethiopia comes 85% of Nile water, which is important for Sudan and Egypt. And so in that regard, very, very important and very strategic. And then the Red Sea Basin also, which is a very strategic point, high, where 40% of world oil trade passes through from the Gulf to Europe. And then the Chinese manufactured goods also, now with the One Belt, One Road, or BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, that Red Sea Basin becomes extremely very strategic for control. And thus imperialism is very, very much interested in controlling this. this area. It has been interested in controlling it since the days of FDR, since the end of the Second World War. It is not by coincidence that FDR, after the Yalta Conference, came to the Suez Canal and summoned these three leaders and mapped out for future control of imperialism. So as I said, imperialism landed on us and still, beating us with its interventionism, R2P interventionism that is currently happening. I'm not going to go into lengths into that, but we have to bear in mind this important historical context. Now, my friend Muhammad and I often talk about the new Horn of Africa. What is it? Well, after the past 6 decades at least of vicious cycle of conflicts, ethnic marginalizations, state collapse, and what have you, it seems that that old era of vicious permanent crisis, sort of forever wars that bedevil our region is coming to an end. A new era is struggling to be born. There are birth pangs. I mean, there's a good beginning of the peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia that finally was achieved after 2 decades of, senseless war and hostilities, the collapse of the ethno-fascist TPLF junta, which also includes Somalia now in the tripartite agreement of peace and friendship. That's very important. These are the 3 pillars of the Horn of Africa. Somalia is emerging after decades of state collapse, clanism, warlordism, and what have you. Finally, Somalia is emerging from the ashes and is reconstituting itself. And so, if this tripartite, the 3 pillars of the Horn of Africa come together, and the people of the region are also awakening, as my friend Muhammad already said, there's a growing consciousness that, people are tired of these forever wars or these vicious cycles of conflicts and wars. And also the marginalization, center-periphery tensions, which tears apart countries, as happened in the Sudan. Sudan is a perfect example of, failure of leadership since post-independence. They did not manage the center-periphery tensions. Ethnic groups are marginalized, and as they are marginalized, they have no option to make the center listen, but to take up arms. And that's how South Sudan became independent. South Sudan, for example, the first option of Dr. John Garang, of the leader of SPLM, was to constitute a new Sudan, to end marginalization, a new Sudan, democratized, ending of this Islamist regime. That was his first option. If that was not possible, he said as a second option, well, the right of self-determination is always there on the table. But he was assassinated or died in mysterious circumstances, and the rest, what happened to South Sudan, is what we know. What I'm saying is marginalization, the center periphery, the incorrect handling of contradictions of ethnicities, nations, nationalities within nation states leads to constant war. So that era is about to come to an end. There is now a growing understanding that the rights of nations, nationalities, ethnic groups must be respected within the confines of that nation state. But more importantly, there is an understanding also that the nation state itself is not the ultimate answer. We have to go beyond the nation state and form an economic cooperation and integration of a bloc to survive with imperialist intervention, the era of globalization. We have to have a big market, a common market of the Horn of Africa. This the imperialists will not like. They don't like it. It was tried in the 1960s, 1970s in East Africa. Remember East African Community? They sabotaged it. The British they made sure that it would not go anywhere. For a while, the East Africans, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, had a common East African shilling, East African Airways, and what have you. There was great hope that an economic community, a common market was emerging. But what do you know? Imperialism always intervenes and makes sure that no such thing happens. This is the fierce struggle now that is happening in the Horn of Africa. TPLF, well, TPLF is, for a while, for 3 decades almost, it was a trusted client proxy of imperialism. Imperialism is now struggling to resuscitate this, but it's a dead horse for all practical purposes. As President Issa said, it's game over for the TPLF. The TPLF cannot be resuscitated. Yeah, sure, they may try to push here and there, create havoc in the Amhara region, in Afar region, as massacres we are witnessing in Galikoma in the Afar region, in China, and what have you. But these are like the death throes. You know, it's dying, but it's refusing to die quietly and peacefully. I mean, these kleptocrats of the TPLF, they have looted and plundered massive amounts of wealth from Ethiopia the past 3 decades. Never has the African continent witnessed such level of kleptocracy as the TPLF. Instead of exiting and enjoying their looted money, which is deposited in banks in the West, they know, the imperialists know where all that money is deposited. But they will not, they will not insist on returning that money to its rightful owners, the Ethiopian people. They still have hope to somehow resuscitate, to manufacture R2P, humanitarian interventionism, and what have you, to continue the war. But the ultimate aim is to sabotage the emergence of the new Horn of Africa. This is the fierce contest, the fierce struggle we are now facing. I hope, I'm not going to take longer time. My time is about to end, I think. But I think that the forward movement of history is in favor of the emergence of the new Horn of Africa. People of the African continent are also waking up. Another factor of imperialist intervention in Africa is AFRICOM, that military, that sinister military, octopus tentacles everywhere, creating, coup d'etats here and there, as we saw in Guinea recently, which the Breakthrough News, Eugene and Rania, you did a good interview with the Congolese revolutionary Kambale, who explained it beautifully. It's people must listen to it again. But the coup d'etats he pointed out were not only in Guinea. In Mali, coup d'etat happened. Also in Chad. So this is what AFRICOM is about. And it is, AFRICOM is not so much based on physical military bases, garrisons. Yes, there are garrisons like in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, elsewhere in Niger, and what have you. But what makes it sinister is that it occupies African national armies. Thus, it's sabotaging national sovereignty. If the national armies are occupied, their minds are occupied. The colonel, for example, who did the coup d'etat, he was occupied. He was trained by the Americans. He himself was French legionnaire. So allegiance to France right there from the beginning. Why the President Condé brought him in the first place is beyond me. Anyways, not to say that Condé himself was a saint, but the point is, in the African continent, there is growing resistance to AFRICOM, which is another imperialist intervention, which is also happening in our part of the world, in the Horn of Africa. So these are the kinds of issues. My friend Mohammed has already touched about the great rivalry now between China and U.S. imperialism, the Western imperialism. Well, as we saw, Afghanistan withdrawal, which is not really a withdrawal. Some say that the contest or the arena of battle, of contest, maybe shifting to the Horn of Africa or to the African continent. Great resources in Africa, so imperialism's loot and plunder is very important. Vital strategic resources such as cobalt, uranium, bauxite, huge amounts of gold, coltan, which is important for the IT industry. So, as we have seen in 1885, the old scramble of Africa, we are now witnessing the new scramble of Africa. And in this regard, the Horn of Africa is, I think, a hotbed of this contest, and thus all the more reason to struggle, to make it plain to the masses of our people what is at stake, what imperialism is doing. This great humanitarian intervention, which is inhumanitarian intervention, the continuation of wars, but the hope of the emergence of the new Horn of Africa, which is, struggling to emerge. And there's great hope that it will emerge because people are fed up of decades of endless wars, in particular in Horn of Africa. It has left our region as the most impoverished, in dire need of development, in dire need of peace. And this, I think, is a good way for me to conclude, but to say that we have to be pessimists by intellect, but optimists by the will to resist, the will to continue the struggle and to make sure that, the new Horn of Africa, gets fully born and starts to walk, take its first step, and then grow rapidly to create the great block of a common market, a region of peace and cooperation. That is what we struggle for, and that for that we have great hope. So thank you very much. I may have taken longer than what is the time allotted to me, but as an elder, a few minutes, I think you will let that slide. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mr. Amare. And now to close us out, I'd like to invite Simon Tesfamariam, Executive Director of the New Afrika Institute. Last, but certainly not least.
Thank you. I am very impressed by all the speakers, comrades, colleagues. Thank you so much for inviting, People's Forum. Thank you for inviting us here and co-sponsoring this event along the Answer Coalition. This is a big step for the people of the Horn of Africa. As we know, today, actually I should say, it's a holiday for many people in the Horn of Africa, and so I'd like to say Happy New Year to those who are celebrating. And also, today, as we know, is interestingly 9/11, and it's a very important day in this nation's history because of when we're talking about imperialism, some of the things that happened as a consequence of the events on that day still reverberate today. Imperialism is also what caused Ethiopia's own 9/11 to happen on November 4th last year. So basically, you had the TPLF, which is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, attacked a military base, a series of sites in the region known as Tigray, and initiated a war against its own country, Ethiopia. And so what happened was that they killed thousands of Ethiopian soldiers who had been defending the country, in fact, helping the people of Tigray by fighting locusts at the time. And so what happened since then is what basically transpired for the next months, what's being called, you can call it a conflict, you can call it a war, but many people are dying, and what we're hearing nowadays is genocide. We're hearing allegations of atrocities. And so as you've heard from some of the comrades today, a lot of this is based on disinformation. And we have to understand that people are indeed definitely suffering in the Horn of Africa. But what's happening is that they're using disinformation to bring war against Ethiopia, to bring people who are fighting for sovereignty, for dignity, for self-respect, for being able to be masters of their own destiny. They are creating all this disinformation to target this country, to bring war to the region. As Eugene said, he talked about unity, to divide. And so what they're doing right now is they're ramping up towards an intervention in that part of the world, and we have to do everything we can to stop it. And so part of why we're here today is we're trying to raise the consciousness of the peoples around the world. The United States here, we have the Answer Coalition, which co-sponsored this event today. A great organization, and I would encourage all people who are listening to this to join Answer Coalition, to take part in discussions like these at the People's Forum. And we have to build connections, and we have to build coalitions and to fight what's coming. And I'm telling you, the United States, as a result of the condition that it currently is in, looting the world of its resources, imperialism throughout the world, 800 military bases, potentially 1,000 if you're talking about dark sites and all this stuff. What's happening is that the Horn of Africa is a major target now. We know that the Biden administration is actually every day getting briefed about Ethiopia and Eritrea at the current moment. Every day. But how often do you hear about it in the news? And so what we're learning is that this is a very critical matter for the United States. They take it seriously, yet they downplay it. Why? Because it's Africa. And Africa is the continent whose affairs you can just brush under the rug. And so it's part of this is racism. Imperialism is impossible without racism. In order to be able to go off and do the things that you do to these dark brown and red and black people around the world, you have to be racist. And what we're hearing is that the Ethiopian army, the Eritrean military is involved in these absurd atrocities. Of course, we have to take them seriously, and we know that people are suffering. But the depictions are absolutely racist if you get into the details. And I'm not going to go into it because it could take, honestly, we can have an entire session on all that. But what I want you to know is that they are ramping up towards war, and they're using the same type of program that they used in Libya. If we can go back to 2011, we remember that Libya was one of the most advanced countries in Africa. In fact, it had the highest development index in Africa. Number 1, 53 in the world. And what happened was that we saw that they used the humanitarian excuse in order to bring war on the Libyan peoples and destroy that country. And so what happened was that they said that humanitarian corridors were blocked, and therefore that they needed to have a no-fly zone in order to bring the humanitarian aid to the Libyan people so that they could eat and that they could survive. And so we're seeing the same type of excuse being used in Ethiopia at this current moment, in northern Ethiopia, in Tigray. And what's happening, or I should go back and also say that another excuse that they used, and who was this, Susan Rice, what she said was that Gaddafi was giving black mercenaries in the southern part of the country Viagra to go and rape women. And notice the racial dimension. This is a black woman who was saying this. And being racist against black people, and basically creating this trope of these sexual predators going just hungry for sex and going after these innocent Libyans. And we know now that that was a lie, because they admitted that it was a lie. And so we're seeing similar sexual violence allegations, atrocity propaganda being used to ramp up for war on the Horn of Africa. It's not just Ethiopia. This is a war that goes back decades. It predates TPLF. It predates the Derg. It predates the monarchy of Haile Selassie. It goes back hundreds of years since the United States entered into a relationship with Ethiopia. And so what they did was they find a partner in the region who is willing to take part in the looting and the exploitation and the plundering of the resources of that region. And so what they've done is the latest manifestation is TPLF. And what we've heard from Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is a very critical thing back in February. What he said, he published this in Project Syndicate, and he called it Toward a New Order in the Horn of Africa. He said that he was overseeing for the first time a nation that was now not going to be ran by, governed by racism, religion, ethnicity. And this is a major factor, an absolutely major factor when we're talking about the Horn of Africa, because this is exactly what they've used to divide and conquer the region. This is a well-known imperial policy. And so what's happened is they've used dividing and conquering, and TPLF, just to give you a little history about them, going back to the 80s, we now have evidence that they were actually getting funding from the CIA. And we know this because of a Freedom of Information Act request that revealed this information. We also know that they were using humanitarian aid, or money that was raised at a time of famine in 1984. Some of you may be old enough to remember when the Band-Aid campaign, where they raised and We Are the World, to raise money to bring money to that region to end famine. But 95 out of $100 million was actually taken by TPLF, stolen, and used for military arms in order to bring them to power. So they came to power, and they instilled in Ethiopia a system known as ethnic federalism. Just to simplify it, we don't like to use, like Malcolm X said, make it plain. It was state-sanctioned or institutionalized tribalism. And so tribalism is a problem throughout Africa. You may approach someone who talks to you and says, I'm a revolutionary, they speak the leftist language, they say this and that, and then they use language of Stalin by saying nations, nationalities, and peoples, and things like that. But behind this Marxist, leftist rhetoric, you have to ask, who is this person? A lot of times you may be talking to a tribalist. And this is the problem that confuses so many people. Particularly here in the United States, when I talk to people, they'll say Tigray genocide, and I'll say, okay, tell me more, what are you hearing? Next thing you know, they're talking about basically how Ethiopia was never really a nation. It's multiple nations within a nation. And they've taken this further and further and further to the point where now John Markakis, which is a scholar, well-known scholar coming from the left, actually was sent to Ethiopia on through a CIA program to study Ethiopia. And actually this was openly admitted to me while speaking to him, honestly. But he doesn't hide this fact. But he says today, he had a recent publication that says that, you know what, I don't know the exact title, but it was basically like the era of nation states is over in Africa. It's basically questioning if nation states should exist in Africa anymore. Should they be based on tribe? Should they be based on other models? And this is the reason for this. They don't want this. The United States does not want 1,000 different tribes that they have to deal with. This is a result of the absolute failure in the Horn of Africa. Because what they did was, TPLF had a program. They were really bad at it. 2005, they lost an election and murdered a bunch of innocent Ethiopians. And so after 2005, they started working towards creating an opposition. Through the National Endowment for Democracy and the State Department, they did the same thing with Eritrea. They started funding these different groups. The idea was to fund the next generation of leaders who could then take over. And what they found is that, first of all, some of them there was too much infighting. But they also found that, hey, these people are pretty nationalist. They actually want their country, they want an Ethiopia to exist. So eventually what they found was that the ones who were willing to really go all the way were the tribalists. And so they started to fund these groups, and by 2009, 2010, these groups started talking about my ethnic group first, my whatever first. And so then what happened was that they started talking about this idea of something called consociationalism. I'm not going to go too much into the details, but the basic point is it's something like what you see in Yugoslavia, where if there's too many warring factions that need to come to the table to rule, they basically rule like the turning of the table. So maybe today it'll be the Tigrayans, tomorrow it'll be the Amhara, and then the next day it'll be the Oromos. And it's a way of dealing with just really hostile elements within a country. And so they've tried this model in Lebanon, which is a failure as well. And so the point is they still, to this very day, envision that the tribalist will be able to form a government in Ethiopia in which different warring factions will be able to take turns at leadership. And like I said, they didn't want to go in this direction because it's hard to talk to 1,000 different warlords and, you know, warring peoples. You'd prefer to go to one person who tells you, you know, let me exploit your resources, I'll kick you a couple chips, and then, you know, we'll take most of it, and you'll live like a king or queen. And so, you know, so the thing is that this is the model that they're now going for in Ethiopia. Similarly in Somalia with clanism. They do this with clanism, right? And so they divide and they conquer. In Eritrea, fortunately, luckily, because of the Eritrean Revolution and what had happened in 1991, the consummation of independence, and as you know, Dr. Muhammad Hassan mentioned, you know, very sophisticated leadership at that time was able to then, you know, really governed by a vanguard party. Basically, we've been able, in Eritrea has been able to kind of serve as a resistance in the African continent. We see similar things in Latin America and Cuba's role. But now, Ethiopia is the giant. Ethiopia is awake. Ethiopia is kicking. And what it is doing is, it makes me so proud to see the Ethiopians, the Somalis, the Eritreans coming together, the Djiboutians, the Sudanese as well. And we can talk about the greater Horn of Africa, and then we can talk about Africa. But you know, I heard John Garang's name and the idea of a new Sudan. New Sudan was this vision of a Sudan that would be not based on ethnicity, religion, race, region. Region is an issue that a lot of people don't know about, regionalism. But what you know, and then we also heard the term new Horn of Africa, and we can then talk about a new Africa. And so we heard Abiy Ahmed articulate this back in February with the new order that I was talking about, the new order in the Horn of Africa. Basically, the essence of his message was one, there's three things that really stood out to me. Anti-sectarianism. So no more race, religion, ethnicity. No more, number two, anti-war. No more, you know, peace. We need stability. Who started this war? As I mentioned, TPLF started this war. Why? Because they needed the war. They needed the war because they wanted to start their own, I'm not going to get into all the details, but their own independent republic that would invade other regions, basically undermining Eritrean sovereignty and Ethiopian sovereignty. So they're basically against the nation state. The media will never say this. So they had to start the war. So people like this, groups like this, entities like this, they're for war. And so we have to be anti-war. That's the second principle that I picked up from there. Number three, he talked about economic integration. He said the history, the future of Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, all the other countries in the region is intertwined whether we like it or not. We're going to have to learn to live with one another. So he talks about economic integration. So anti-sectarianism, anti-war, economic integration. These are the critical principles, pillars of the future of the Horn of Africa. And I want to say 70%, as Dr. Muhammad Hassan mentioned, 70% of the people in the Horn are under the age of 30. 70%. They don't know what happened with the Soviet Union. I mean, they hear, they didn't live through it. They lived in a post-Soviet Union era, post the collapse of the Soviet Union. They're like Gen Z. We have a lot, the Gen Z generation. And you're seeing Gen Z nowadays standing up, fighting for their rights, facing inequalities here in the US, all around the world. Black Lives Matter. And so what's happening is that these people, there's 140 million people in the Horn of Africa, and with 70% of them being under the age of 30, what that means is that they're tired of the divisions, the war, all that stuff. They want to develop. So TPLF is living in a bygone era. They're of the past. And Kwame Ture spoke of one of my favorite revolutionaries, and I'm sure there are many of us who feel the same way here. He spoke about moving from a higher order, from a lower order to a higher order society, where you start with the family or the individual. You know, you think about yourself. As a baby, you're kind of selfish. You think about yourself. You want to survive. Then you grow up. You start thinking about your family. Then you start thinking about your clan. And then you start thinking about your tribe. And then you have a consciousness of your nation. And then you move towards your region, you know, or continent. And then finally, as humanity, we start looking at, you know, connecting with all of humanity. And today, we are here connecting with humanity across, oceans. The Answer Coalition, it's the largest anti-war, most respected anti-war group that exists, in my opinion, in America today. And it's an honor for the people of the Horn of Africa to share our struggle and connect with Answer. And we need to join in their struggle in the streets here. They join us in our struggle, hopefully visit the Horn of Africa and join. And it's no longer just Eritreans in the streets who are by ourselves in front of, some Capitol building and protesting. It's Ethiopians who are with us now. It's we have, the good peoples in this room, in this forum. And so we should be able to connect these struggles and be fighting for all exploited peoples of the world. And so that's what this is about today. And so we have this Horn of Africa consciousness, and TPLF is living in, like I said, in that bygone era, because now we're moving towards regional integration and thinking about the broader world. And so all these folks that are taking us towards the tribalist direction, the fundamentalist religious type of direction, all these modes of sectarianism. We're done with it. Right. We're done with it. It's time for a new Horn of Africa. I'm excited for the future of the Horn. When President Isaias said "game over" in 2019, let me just say one thing about President Isaias. He doesn't speak very often in absolutes. It's very reserved individual. And so to hear "game over," it was a shock to the Horn of a lot of people, including myself. But now we are seeing, because the United States has no other strategy other than TPLF. That was all, they put all their eggs in that basket. They couldn't find a partner in Ethiopia. They couldn't find a partner that was legitimate in Eritrea or Somalia. So their days are numbered in the Horn of Africa. And I know it's a tough time. I plead with all peoples of the Horn, especially right now, those who are facing incredible amounts of warfare in northern Ethiopia, the Amhara, Afar, our Tigrayan brothers and sisters. Just recognize, we know you all have been propagandized for the last 3 decades. And so we understand why it may be hard to look at Ethiopia and see this larger project, and look at the Horn of Africa and see this larger project, because there's been so much focus on tribalism and narrow forms of nationalism, sub-nationalism. So I plead to see beyond TPLF and any other extremist type of groups that are pushing for their tribe, their religion, their whatever mode of sectarianism it is. So and with that message, I just want to say, we're with the future. The new Horn of Africa is the future. Everybody get on. International solidarity, a luta continua. I also want to share with the world, with everybody here today, the Eritrean saying, Awet Nahafash. It's a battle cry. It means victory to the masses. And so victory to the peoples of the United States, victory to the peoples of Ethiopia, of Eritrea, of Somalia, Djibouti, the entire Horn, victory to all exploited peoples worldwide.
Thank you, Simon. I think a really beautiful way to close this up. Now, once again, let's have another just round of applause for all of our speakers today. It's really been fantastic. Now we want to open up the floor to you all who have joined us. Please raise your hand to be added to the stack. And out of respect for everyone who'd like to comment, try to keep your question or comment under 2 minutes long. And of course, we're always open to dialogue and debate, but we want to have an exchange, we want to keep it respectful, and we want to move through this part of the program relatively quickly, give it about 20 to 25 minutes, because we did start late, of course, so we just want to accommodate that. And also, if you do have a question, make sure that you point it to a particular speaker, just to make things a little bit easier. So, yes, I'll take a hand right over here in the front. Go ahead. Yes, yes.
Okay, hi everyone, my name is Dina. Thank you to all the speakers for I'm so blown away by all of the new things that I've learned today. I'm gonna make mine kind of short, and I think any panelist can respond to this question. So my question has to do with, I think it was Eugene who mentioned AFRICOM and how we should keep that in mind when we're thinking about, all that's happening in the Horn of Africa, especially Eritra's role in that whole history, Eritrea being like the only African country that doesn't have AFRICOM in it. So Eritrea is also one of like the only African countries and like small African countries at that with like a truly disciplined military. So a lot of times when we're talking about AFRICOM, the conversation has to do with, the US wanting to get US boots on the ground in African countries. But I also want to hear you talk a little bit more about the threats of Africans who are armed, militarily trained, and also nationalists, and what that means in the bigger picture or against the backdrop of other African militaries on the continent.
I will speak to it. Also want to note, Elias raised AFRICOM as well, so certainly if others want to speak to this. But no, I really appreciate the question because, I mean, we have to see how slick the U.S. can be at times when you think about AFRICOM. So last year they actually said, well, we're going to dismantle AFRICOM. We've dismantled AFRICOM, partially because they were being so embarrassed because on the African continent it was being so poorly received. But what they did was a very interesting trick, is they said, we're combining AFRICOM with U.S. European Command. So it made it look as if the U.S. was stepping back from Africa, but in fact, they were increasing the number of troops and the capabilities they had to intervene on the continent, which we saw earlier this year when the 101st Airborne went to Somalia as part of a military mission. And so in fact, while appearing to take a step back, they were actually reinforcing their military power, but clouding it a little bit in terms of like who was what and what exactly was going on, but in order to increase their ability to intervene, which is also, I would say, to some degree related to the support for France. Also, even though this is a little bit of a subsidiary conversation, the whole conversation in Germany about rearming and increasing their military is about intervening in Africa. But I say that just to say that I think obviously the United States feels very strongly that they have to have even more advanced troops. In many ways, the best troops they have, right? The troops that are pushed up against the border with Russia and Ukraine and so on and so forth to be able to intervene in a larger, more effective way on the African continent. The plurality of special forces operations by the United States military writ large are now happening on the African continent, more than we really know. And Djibouti, of course, is a very central piece of this, one of the few countries where there is a US military base. So I say all that just to say that I think it's absolutely critical for the point that you're making that most of the other militaries in Africa are not really legitimate. I mean, many of them are just thugs. I mean, you look at Nigeria, for instance, Mali, all of these countries where they have built up these huge militaries, allegedly under the guise of counterterrorism, but they can never defeat anybody. And in fact, the only thing they seem to really be able to do is terrorize their own population. I mean, they train all these helicopter pilots in England for Nigeria and say, well, we're going to go after ISIS, but every time you turn around, quote unquote ISIS, and there's a lot to be said about that, seems to only be getting larger, but I can certainly read about villages all over northern Nigeria where civilians are being shot down by these same helicopter pilots, who also, by the way, vacation in the beaches of the UK when they go for that training. So ultimately, when it comes down to really doing the fighting, the US knows that they have to be on the ground, that they have to be there, that they have to train these forces, and they fear any independent government in Africa and really around the world. And they want to have people they can push around. And I think absolutely when you look at Eritrea, that is certainly the case, that they have a strong military, a powerful military that is not easily pushed around, and that they have an independent policy foreign policy. You also argue domestic policy if you look at sort of the IMF consensus, and that is really the most dangerous thing, is to have someone who can act on their own power, and that's why countries that do so, like Libya, must be undermined at all times. You know, to some degree, I think that was the motivation behind U.S. policy in Sudan in terms of division of the country. I think it certainly is the policy in terms of bringing various countries like Angola and others into the sort of broader imperialist fold in the 1990s, that anyone who can really defend themselves and fight for themselves. Why do they have Rwanda as the major proxy of the United States and the ability to fight all over the continent, and they fly them everywhere, most recently Mozambique, is because they know that anyone with an independent mind and an actual military force that's trained and can fight can resist what they're trying to push forward on the African continent. So I think, one, bottom line, just important to note that AFRICOM is actually redoubled, reformed, and even stronger now than ever because the U.S. is expecting to put more troops on the ground, in my belief, in Africa in the coming, I don't know, 6 now and into the next few years.
We have Kay. I'll just, first, and then I got you.
Yeah, thank you for all of your presentations. First of all, question to maybe Eugene and Simon, who spoke about the lies that are being told about what's happening in Ethiopia. Just like obviously the media coverage is so one-sided. So how do you really discern what's happening on the ground? And like, if you could give examples of like really what they're sort of distorting. I mean, you touched on it a little bit, Simon, but if you could maybe go further in depth. And then also, one thing that was really interesting to me that you were talking about, Simon, is the integration of the Horn of Africa and these 3 pillars sort of combining. But, it seems like a lot of regions of the world that are, I guess, like under the boot of U.S. imperialism are sort of integrating their economies more and more and, to I guess, block the U.S.'s unilateralism in Latin America and Asia. So I was wondering if there are other regions of Africa that are, sort of integrating and what it could really mean for the continent in the face of like all of this, foreign investment and this sort of foreign predatory activity in Africa. Thank you.
So you have various blocks in East Africa. I honestly feel like, Mohammed or Elias should be able to speak to this probably better than myself, but how about it? And then maybe afterwards I can come back, because I think they would just, so maybe Mohammed?
Okay. First of all, I wanted to give some information to the listeners, which the media doesn't explain. The TPLF built Ethiopian army. The Ethiopian army, in fact, it have never been an Ethiopian army. To tell you, 80% of the generals, they were Tigrayans. 50% of the lieutenant colonels and the colonels are Tigrayans. 50% of the major and the fighting forces are Tigrayans. In fact, Prime Minister Abiy, when he came to power, the Ethiopian National Army, literally, it is a Tigrayan army. Imagine in such a situation you become a prime minister. Second, Ethiopia was ruled by 100,000 intelligence service. The biggest budget of the country was allocated to the intelligence service. This intelligence service, 35% of them are Tigrayan speakers. Because of this condition, the TPLF and its friends, they believed they can stay and rule Ethiopia for the coming 50 years. That is their calculation. In 2014, I was in Asmara, in Eritrea. In the morning, I listened to the news, Amharic program, and that day it says there is a popular revolt in a very small village near to Addis Ababa called Ginche. So I didn't give my attention. After 2 days, that popular revolt continued into another bigger city. When I heard that, I wrote a very long email to a friend of mine. He is working in a development bank giving some loans to the farmers in Ethiopia, about 10,000 Ethiopian birr, the maximum. That year, 2014, Ethiopian farmers, particularly in the center, had the best harvest. So I wrote to my friend, I told him, I want you to go 130-kilometer radius around Addis Ababa, and I want you to tell me how is the condition of the peasant. In normal circumstance, when the peasant have good harvest, automatically they change their clothes, they paint their doors, they marry their daughter and sons, and it is a feast. It is a very nice economic situation in the village. So he wrote me, he said, what do you want me to check? I said the condition, that is there a lot of weddings, did the people bought a lot of ox and slaughtering and dividing among themselves. I'm telling you about the peasant condition. Of course, very difficult for you, the Americans, to understand, including you, CIA never understood. The so clever CIA of you. Then my friend wrote me back, he said, can you specify? I said, I gave him the description which I told you now. Then he went around and he told me, Mr. Muhammad, the 5 points which you mentioned, I didn't see it on the peasantry. On the contrary, he said, we as a bank, we give until 10,000 birr loan to the peasant, and most of the peasants refuse to take loans. Then I wrote a book in 2016. The title of the book, Ethiopia at Crossroads. TPLF is over. Now, how do you calculate things if you see things from a popular classes position or from the ruling class position? United States have 2 embassies in Addis Ababa with a very good PhDs from Harvard, Yale, Cornell, and name it. Very beautiful tie. They wear very nice shirt. They have very good salaries. They couldn't, their early warning system was very poor. TPLF was gone. Everybody can see that the end of TPLF through this popular revolt. That's why in 2017, when we were making interview with the president of Eritrea, President Comrade Elias Amare, he said, TPLF game is over. US game is over. Because they believed that they were training their intelligence service. They give them money. They give them everything. They shower them. They give them the diplomatic cover and so on. But at the end, history it is made by the people. It's not by the people who are sitting in air-conditioned bureaus in Washington, D.C. Their agent melted like ice cream in the summer. and they got very surprised. I can imagine that it is Sudan rice, all these other, they were surprised. They said, what happened? Because they don't live the life of the masses. The second point I want to clarify for you, a young prime minister, elected, he came, Dr. Abiy. He have no bodyguard. He have no army. He have no intelligence and so on. And he came to his office. So the first thing he have to do, to liberate first his office. Can you manage that? Can you slowly consolidate your power? I'm sure the American diplomats, they say, this man, he will not survive 1 week. His days are limited. But he survived. He turned the table upside down. Finally, the TPLF got frustrated because they went to Tigray and they started a strategy of chaos. They have a huge amount of money in their hand. They were sending weapons inside Ethiopia and destabilizing. They were mobilizing conferences. He did one thing, the Prime Minister, a monetary policy. He changed the currency. The old currency in the hand of the TPLF, they cannot bring it to the bank and explain because they have to explain from where they got it. Finally, they were advised by United States to attack 80% of Ethiopian army is stationed in Tigray. 80% of the Ethiopian army equipment, it is stationed in Tigray. The young man who's sitting near to Simon, you are a clever young man. Have you ever seen a prime minister who doesn't have even a bike, not even a bodyguard, in a country of 110 million? 80% of the troops are stationed in Tigray. They have $40 billion in their hand and everything, and he manages. We should say to this man, he's clever. He should explain to us how he survived. This frustrated the State Department. This frustrated the TPLF friends. Because their assumption, they see things from the sky, but they don't see the sentiment of the Ethiopian people who have suffered 27 years under the TPLF. They became for him the bodyguards. Masses make history. And that is the good example what happened in Ethiopia. The same to come to the second point. The US, they might have Apache helicopter. They might have Africom and dollar in their pocket, including the French. But when you do surveillance on the basis of the language of the population and the culture and the psychology. How somebody born, brought up, trained in Texas, do you think can he make a surveillance inside Somalia? We should not exaggerate the capacity of the imperialists. These are, in real terms, they can be dangerous, but at the same time, they are paper tigers. Africans, one of the most advantageous continents we have We have a lot of languages. Our languages are so multiplied with a lot of dialects. I think Apple itself tried to organize it but didn't succeed. To make surveillance on the population, to police the population, to understand the psychology of the population, it's not an easy business. They might be on boots, they might fly from one place to another place, but these foreigners who come in our ground, in our villages, we can isolate them. We can fight them. The only thing they can do, they bombard, as they did in Afghanistan. They can throw missiles, but very difficult to understand our psychology. Their information capacity on the ground, surveillance capacity on the ground is very poor. I'm not undermining them. To conclude, what is the experience we learn from the situation of Afghanistan? I really advise the young people who are sitting and listening to me to read the British general who wrote about his experience in the first Afghan-British war. It's a beautiful book. The Afghanis, they were primitive. The British, they were dominating the whole world. And he was marching toward Kabul in the first British-Afghan war. An old man with his grandchild was sitting, and he saw this armada of British troops with Indian troops are marching to Kabul. Old man, he stood up and he started praying. The British commander, he was felt offended. He said, how this filthy Afghani Pashto old man, he doesn't see my armada. I am marching toward Kabul. He didn't look at me, and he continues to pray. He stopped. He said, bring that old man toward me. And they brought the old man. And then he asked the old man, you don't see us with all these troops, with all this armada, we are going to Kabul. The old man answered, he said, I see, yes, you are going to Kabul. But I am thinking, he said, once you go in Kabul, how you will go out tomorrow. This is the first British invasion in Afghanistan. The third British invasion in Afghanistan, they brought 740,000 troops. By that moment, Britain invented planes, tanks, and so on. People's will, you cannot crush it because you have a sophisticated weapon. We should be very balanced when we explain to the masses. We should tell to our sons and daughters in the US Army who are joining AFRICOM. Africa is a very big continent. It's not very easy to go to Africa and to succeed. I will stop here. Majority of African young people who are born the last 60 years, they have never seen colonialism, and they don't know colonialism. And they are not frightened like their grandparents when they see colonial troops on the ground. Second, You can only defeat a people, you win a segment of the population of that nation. But they couldn't win in Afghanistan. They spent $8 trillion and they lost. They ran away like small girls from Kabul. I think we should believe the masses, if they are organized, if they are aware, they can struggle. Imperialism have no time. It comes to loot resources. To loot resources, you need to invest. You have to exploit the labor. You need peace. They don't have that chances now. It's undermining them. But in history, what I have understood is the psychological welfare they are trying to do on our youth, it will never succeed. I'm sure they are listening to me. And the young people who are asking on that, I'm telling them from Europe, from near to Brussels, I don't think French troops in Mali are now succeeding. Neither they are succeeding in Niger, nor they are succeeding in Chad. The other factor, the peace which we see in Europe, this peace is at the expense of African looting. 67 million population. Africa, particularly French Africa, is subsidizing France 400 billion euro every year. So the relationship between the working class and the ruling class in France is ensured by the exploitation of African resources. The day that resources decrease, the possibility of having peace in France will decline. The contradiction in France will be antagonistic. That is what it frightens them, that they don't want Africans to work together. That is what it frightens them, the new Horn of Africa. Thank you. I made a big speech, but this is what I see. France already have now the Afghanistan of her in Mali, in Niger. I will invite you, come to Belgium. The electricity which you see, without the uranium of Niger, there will never be electricity in France or Belgium. Belgium is a dependent imperialist country of France. So please, my brothers and sisters in the United States.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hassan. All right, I'll give it over to this brother in the orange top.
Thank you so much. I have a pair of questions. The first one will be general of for whoever can answer it, either Brother Elias, Dr. Mohammed Hassan, or anyone of the panelists. And I will continue. This is my question is, countries' foreign policy is always dictated by the national security or geopolitical reasons that we say. And what is the big wisdom behind when we can have peace and development on those countries, which is very important for the Horn of Africa, is a very important route for the maritime route. And isn't it a win-win situation while those countries can cooperate, develop, and cooperate, which is give and take with the West, and they can improve both the African and the Western lives. So what is the big wisdom behind that they have to fight and be disintegrated? I don't know, where is the win? Where is the profit that comes from this destruction? This is number one. Number two is a little bit for the African American think tanker or African American intellectuals, let me say, or politicians. Maybe Brother Eugene, you are in there, so you can explain that. I see African Americans, you will expect them to strengthen the cooperation with Africans in Africa and in the diaspora, but they seem to follow, whether they are Democrats or Republicans or whoever they are, they seem to follow one route or just kowtow one, like the majority of the people, like somebody said, if you are following the news, you are, if you're not following the news, you are not informed. But if you are following the news, you are misinformed. So my point is, like, I see these big politicians in, especially they were in the Horn of Africa, or like Susan Rice or Jendai Fraser, Linda Thomas, Johnny Carson, and even here at a local, like Gregory Mix, who came from very humble family in Queens. But all they seem to follow the same without any opposition. Is that, how can we change this? I thank you.
So, whether it's the Republicans, whether it's the Democrats, we've seen it's just, they take turns in managing the empire. But the problem is, at the end of the day, it's still an empire. And that's the problem. And we can't think of, the way the United States is going to approach the Horn as like a rational sort of thing, because the system is irrational that they are managing. And this irrational system, capitalism, the highest stage being imperialism, has to go off into parts of the world and exploit different markets, and the Horn of Africa is one of them. And so the thing is that when they do these things and they destroy countries, they're doing it. It is rational, but it's part of this irrational system. And I know Michael Parenti talks a lot about that sort of thing in the past. But so what I'm saying is we can't expect the Democrats or the Republicans to solve this problem. We can try to win them over, but at the end of the day, it's still an empire, and so that is the key issue. So I think I'll leave it at that. And I just wanted to address something that Kay was talking about. It was about the disinformation thing, and actually you brought it up as well too. Is like if you're being misinformed if you actually follow the news. So let me just, there's always like the big lies that they have in a war when they're ramping up for a war. So really, there's the so-called Aksum massacre. So back at the end of November, they said that there was a massacre of 700 people by the way, there's coffee going around for everyone here. It is a holiday, so I hope everyone is enjoying it. Low cultural dimension here, but I just want to say, so going back to the disinformation. So the Aksum massacre, it was said that there were 700 people that died that day, and what we found out later, well, first of all, they reported that first through a group known as the EEPA. Just a little fringe group that I don't really want to go into very much, but they said they made the claim first, so it wasn't on the ground reporting. It wasn't a primary news source that reported this. But in January, they then reported it. And then what happened was that they lowered the number down and said progressively from that point on. But I mean, basically, my point is with the massacre, they couldn't find any evidence. And in fact, what happened was that it came out that the very next day after the supposed massacre, there was a huge celebration in the city of Aksum, which is this historic town, ancient history, ancient town, ancient city. And they're on TV just, saying how great of a celebration it was. And if you read the Amnesty International reports that had come out after that, they're talking about like the stench of death in the air, bodies littering the streets everywhere. And they're supposedly these very happy people. And in fact, the very day before, which was the 29th, they had actually they had a church service at the end of the day. So the very day of the massacre, there's a church service at the church that they said a massacre happened at. How on earth is that possible? You can talk about the so-called Dangalat massacre, where they have a person on video who is saying, some number of people have died, and then in this video, there is a person. This is the full-length video, not the slight segment that CNN took. The full version of the video, which was circulating online already, it shows this person saying he's a villager, an old man, and there's a guy who's filming, and there's a guy who's like on the side, and the guy says, the villager says, there's some number of people dead. It's something, he says like 200. The guy on the side walks up and says, no, it's something. You can hear him whispering to the guy, telling him to change the number. And the cameraman's like, hey, tell him. And so if you don't understand the language, you wouldn't be able to know this. But we know this, knowing the language. And so then Nima Abagar, the reporter from CNN who reported this, just ignored us when we commented, we went after her to make her sure that she was being honest. She just ignored us. Blocked some of us on Twitter or whatever. And then now she's coming up with, she just had a recent report this week at a very critical time when TPLF is on its heels. After the ceasefire, they invaded the Amhara and the Afar regions and just committed all these horrible things, atrocities, killed Eritrean refugees, reprisal killings against the Tigrayan people who they had because they were in the bushes fighting a guerrilla warfare temporarily. When they came back, there was like these reprisal killings against the administrators. They killed the administrators. So after all this, because of the government had moved back in order to allow the farmers to farm because of I'm not going to go into detail. Basically, we didn't want a famine to happen, and so they pulled back. And so then TPLF took advantage of this, even captured a historic church, Lalibela, to town, Lalibela. And it was broadcast on global TV. The United States went silent. They couldn't say anything. So now they're on their heels as ENDF, the federal forces, are on the march, pushing them back into the region of Tigray. And then what's happened is that now all of a sudden Nima Abagar comes out of nowhere and says, hey, there's a new massacre that's going on. When all this time, there'd been all these massacres and the use of child soldiers. Broadcast on New York Times, literally the cover of New York Times, you see child soldiers. Yet it's not questioned. It's so brazen, it's so in your face. It has totally radicalized the people of the Horn of Africa. So I thank you, New York Times. I thank you, Empire, for doing what you have done. So this level of disinformation is used to, ramp up war. And like I said, it's just so blatant and so in your face that, whether you're talking about the Duma gas massacre in Syria, or you're talking about all the stuff they're making about the Uyghurs and, all this disinformation we see, whether it's, people pushing trains in North Korea, to, get to make the train move. There's just disinformation everywhere, every country that they target. And I just want to say, I've been following this stuff for years, since I was in high school. And I have never seen this level of disinformation in my life. And so it's up there with all the great, these disinformation operations that we see around the world. And I'm just glad that we're able to share this with everyone here today.
Yeah. Well, just to speak really quickly to the issue of the African American community, and thank you so much. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for the coffee, for all of the food, and to everybody. Round of applause, please, if we could, for folks who are putting this together on the new year. I think it's relatively easy to understand when you put it in the sort of longer context of Black history, because of course when the Congressional Black Caucus began to emerge as a force in US politics, it was in the context of the rising radicalism of the Black liberation movement. And of course, many of the early CBC members were very engaged on Africa. They were really sort of the central sort of pillar inside of the US political establishment, pushing back on the US policy of supporting apartheid and all these various other reactionary countries. But, to just fast forward to today and to mention the names that you brought up of Susan Rice and Genji Frazier and Johnny Carson, all these individuals who, for those who don't know, are sort of the major names in US Africa policy in the 1990s and the 2000s, it's really part and parcel of the defeat of that radical sector of the Black liberation movement and the domestication of groups like the Congressional Black Caucus, where they say, well, there will not be total Black freedom and liberation, and that's just how it's going to be. But you yourself can be elevated to a much higher level inside of the governing structure, but it's predicated on you accepting the politics of the status quo in terms of U.S. foreign policy. So you can have Black faces in high places, but only if they have the correct policy standpoint. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Certainly what we're seeing in relationship to the Horn of Africa. You look at someone like Karen Bass, who, if this was 30 years ago, might have had a very different position, but was very quick to sort of jump on whatever the mainstream narrative may have been. So it's really a big piece of how, as a Black politician in America, you can solidify that you are, in fact, allegiant to the system really anywhere in the world, but in particular Africa, act in such a way that sort of your face and your reality becomes a major front in terms of the ability to misrepresent the policies. But if I could just take a slight indulgence and speak a little bit to your question, Kay. I think this is where critical reading is always so important when we understand the issue of misinformation, because sometimes even in reports that are very decontextualized and designed to distract you, you actually have critical information that can change the whole narrative. If people here read, and some I know have read and remember the New York Times article that came out, the front page article that was about, when somehow, some way, the New York Times got into the capital of Tigray. It's all about how they're taking over the country and how everyone loves them. Very interestingly, in one of the early paragraphs, it notes that prior to the conflict, the TPLF did not have a majority support inside of Tigray. And I have to say, it was an offhanded point in the newspaper article, but I find that extremely interesting, because the whole narrative of the TPLF is that the injustice that was done by the canceling of the election was that, well, everyone loves them and everyone supports them and they have 100% support. So the only reason they would cancel election, it couldn't have anything to do with the raging pandemic. It could only be because they were trying to prevent the world from knowing that they had 100% support amongst the population. So wait, do they have 100% support amongst the population, or did they not? It's a very interesting piece, but it changes the entire understanding not only of the narrative, but of the article itself. And that's just in one piece that's designed to put you in another situation. And just one other small thing I'll say about that I think is important. For 30 some odd years, and going on today, no matter what the TPLF is accused of, no matter how much evidence is put in front of them, it never happened. It's actually shameless in many cases how openly this has never happened. This is not true. This is being distorted. All these other pieces. They've never taken responsibility for anything. When they shot down students in the street in 2005, never happened. Anyway, I won't go into all the long list of their atrocities. But I point that out to say, if you look at the conduct of the Ethiopian government currently and Abiy Ahmed and really what he brought in when he became prime minister, releases thousands of political prisoners. He brings back a former political prisoner exiled from the country, formerly worked for Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, pushes them in charge of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Now, in the context of this conflict, the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission has made a number of statements, some about the Ethiopian government, some about the TPLF. There's also the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, by the way, everyone talked about, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is disputing this Amnesty International report in terms of the use of sexual assault, and they were certainly disputing elements of it. But what's also notable is that in the early paragraphs, they are in fact saying, yes, the conduct of our soldiers in many of these cases was not in fact acceptable. They actually tried 30 soldiers for their, for violating the laws and doing things that they viewed as abuses. So I say all that just to say, so wait a second here. If you're the international media and you're looking at this and you say, all right, well, one side, no matter how much evidence we have to prove that what is happening, and they never admit it, they never say anything, we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt. But the other side, which has actually changed the entire political character of the country, so much so that a country, the TPLF when they were in charge, never admitted anything is wrong, that there are actually internal government-controlled organizations that are disputing the facts on the ground, sometimes within the government itself. I mean, that doesn't sound like authoritarianism to me. That actually sounds like a very significant difference in terms of the level of democratic space that's available in Ethiopia. And you think if we were talking about who gets the benefit of the doubt, well, the people who are, it seems to me, are willing to be self-critical and to, in fact, put in place independent forces inside of their own government structure that are willing to look into things and produce reports that may not, in fact, be what I can't say, I'm not in the heart of hearts of the government, but at the very least, may not endorse everything they might want to endorse. I mean, that speaks to a major change in the political culture of a country. And the fact that that's never taken into account in the context of how these things are reported, to me, shows that there is no interest in getting to the truth. Because if you were interested in getting to the truth, you would note facts like that about significant differences in terms of civil liberties, in terms of press freedoms, in terms of admission of various violations of international norms, in terms of war. You would do all that. You would give that side the benefit of the doubt. But instead, you give the benefit of the doubt to people who, no matter how brazen, no matter how open, will lie everything. I mean, it just shows that it's 100% thumb on the scale in terms of what it's designed to do, which is not to give a real view of the conflict, but in fact to create a narrative of events in order to promote what I believe is a policy that is aimed towards at least creating the space for regime change, if not that. So I just wanted to speak to that because I do think it's an important piece of how a lot of these very important issues, I think, are getting lost in the conflict, the conversation, as it were, about what is and what isn't happening on the ground.
I've been trying to give space for applause after all of these really fantastic answers that we've been hearing throughout this discussion. I know we have a couple more hands on the floor here, but I would like to give space to the folks tuning in. There's been about 70 to almost 90 people joining us on YouTube during this live, so I definitely want to acknowledge these folks watching at home. We do have one question from a Leah Kemmel. And the last point Eugene made definitely touches on this in terms of what is the end goal of the TPLF and why hasn't the Ethiopian government been able to terminate this minority terrorist group yet? Maybe if you want to speak to this, Elias, because you haven't spoken yet during this discussion.
You're muted.
I think he's trying to figure out how to mute.
Okay, there you go. Briefly, what's the end goal of TPLF? Well, the end goal has been when they launched the war on November 4. That's very important, crucial point to emphasize. The TPLF started the war on November 4, attacking the northern command where 80% of the Ethiopia's army's capacity was based. By any standard, that act is treasonous, insurrectionary, and so no government on earth would tolerate that. Say if Boko Haram in Nigeria did that, or the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda did that, well, the central government of either Uganda or Nigeria would be more than justified to go against this, treasonous insurrectionary act of force with all the might at its disposal, with full force. But when it came to Ethiopia, the Western media, as part of the disinformation, tries to equate this both-sidism, both sides have to come to the ceasefire and to the negotiating table. That is an impossibility. No country would tolerate such a a treasonous insurrectionary act of war against its national army. That's defiance of its sovereignty, and has to deal with it, to the extent of all force at its disposal. Now, as to the TPLF's end goal, well, when they launched it, their calculation or miscalculation is obvious. Overestimation of their own capacity, that the Ethiopian army is, will be decimated once we attack and take full command of the northern command in Tigray. And then from there to Addis Ababa, it would be a cakewalk. Once there, then we could also take care of Eritrea, whose Eritrean Defense Force is weakened. That was their miscalculation. And there are many wars that start with miscalculation and then overestimation of one's own capacity, which leads to one blunder after the other. And so I think we could speak about the end goal of TPLF as massive miscalculation, which ended in their, in their being decimated. The other end goal, they anticipated also that some allies, sectarian forces inside Ethiopia would join them in an insurrection. The civil war would spread throughout Ethiopia, and this would lead towards disintegration of the state or state collapse. Once this happened, then they would go on for secession or independence. It may sound irrational, but that was their miscalculation again. So on both these counts, the miscalculation, overestimation of their own capacity, also the Western patrons had blown up their capacity. The TPLF in the end was found to be nothing but a paper tiger. Many so-called Western experts and analysts actually did mea culpa. They openly admitted that, they had been wrong in overestimating the TPLF's capacity. So we can speak to the miscalculation of the TPLF of these two major points. The other major miscalculation they did also was to underestimate Eritrea's capacity. Eritrea rightfully does not talk much about its involvement or non-involvement in what happened in the conflict in Tigray. It's right not to do so. I mean, it keeps a strategy of silence. But underestimating Eritrea, I think, has been a grave cause of their miscalculation. Once I heard a German so-called expert of the Horn of Africa, his name is Gunther Schroeder. You can hear to his talk on YouTube if they haven't pulled it down. But a few years ago, he was addressing a crowd of Eritreans in Germany. And when talking about the Eritrean Defense Forces, he said, "Oh, the Eritrean Defense Force is totally, you can't even talk about it as an army. You don't even wish to go to rabbit hunting with that, with the EDF," is what he said, by way of dismissing and underestimating it. Well, now the world knows the capacity of the Eritrean Defense Force, a very highly disciplined army, People's Army, Revolutionary Army, which emerged of a long struggle of 30 years war. It's a people's army. Again, it's based on also as one of its backbones on the national service. A volunteer part of youth makes at least about 50 to 60% of the army, highly motivated, highly disciplined, highly and politically conscious as well. And underestimating the capacity of Eritrean Defense Force, in my opinion, also led to the demise of the TPLF. Let's just leave it at that. The other question, I will let somebody else address it. The second part of that question.
Yep, there we go. I just really want to quickly, if we could give a round of applause to Monica, who is our moderator. She has to run to another event. It's like the third thing she's done today. So doing triple duty, being here to be. So thank you again, Monica. I just wanted to say that. Well, let's try to get a couple questions in here before we close. So I know you here, and I saw your hand a while ago. So maybe let's go right here in the back, and then right here, and then we'll potentially come back. We'll see if someone who hasn't spoken yet is coming, but I appreciate it. And then I see your hand as well. So we'll try to see if we can get 2 or 3 more in here, and then close. We're a little bit over time, but I think we can make it work.
Give the mic.
Behind you, right behind you.
Sorry.
Which question? We're going to come back to it. We're going to cover it. Noted. Thank you very much.
Firstly, Ruhus Qudus Yohannes, thank you to the pillars of our community for just having us and welcoming us. I think we appreciate to understand that for the youth to be cradled as in the belly of the beast, to have the pillars of the community welcome us in that way is just a glimpse of the Eritrean culture and the Eritrean unity for the fight and the struggle of the working class. So thank you again. But my question is, I'm sure the imperial agenda is probably to have a Kosovo in the Horn of Africa, right? So I think Kosovo is like a very recent manifestation of what it means to have like a very secluded area that is underdeveloped. But my question to Mr. Elias and even Dr. Mohammed is, I think as we go forward now within our fight, it's essential for us to understand that the people of Tigray are probably being used as the armor of this whole war, right? Meaning there are people that could be easy comrades within this revolution for us to actually emancipate them from the process of the feudal Tigrayan elite group, right? So what is the process that we need to take to ensure that we give space to Tigrayan people to be part of this side of the story and not necessarily on the other side of the story, right? And I think from my perspective as like someone who studies more of the climate perspective, as the droughts are gonna become more prone within the region of Tigray, the peasant people, especially farmers, are gonna be more inclined to want some form of change from any feudal and elite group within the Tigray regime anyway as it stands, right? So what are some programs or protocols that we can take in place to ensure that they have space within these conversations and these discussions, because there are many voices that are very much alienated from their community. So it would be great to know what we could do from outside and what is being done on the inside. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Before we get answers, I just want to put this other question on the table just so we can get the maximum in here before we hit time. So, Kay, can you just do me a favor and just run this mic over here? Thank you so much.
Okay, so there was a lot of conversation or talk about tribalism and just kind of discussing how we view like the nation state, which I thought was very interesting. So I guess my question is, how do we contend with the very real colonial history of Ethiopia as the nation state that it is today, right? How do we contend with that and its relationships with oppressed nationalities, with the Somali region and the like? So what do we do with that information? How do we include that in these conversations so that we are, we ensure that we are anti-imperialist, that we continue to say no to intervention, no to sanctions, but we can also understand how we include, not even just include them in a conversation, but figure out what the future of the Horn looks like with oppressed nationalities as well, so.
Thank you so much. So I don't know who wants to start. I mean, we had 2 direct questions. I think, Dr. Hassan, Elias, Simon, any of you could probably start anywhere there. So whoever wants to jump in. Simon? Oh, yeah, please go ahead.
So I'll take Yulian's question just because I feel as though it's something I've thought about a lot about. So if we recall here in the US, the Black Panther Party and specifically Fred Hampton in Chicago, we remember the Rainbow Coalition. And with the Rainbow Coalition, you had the Young Lords, Young Patriots, you had the Black Panthers all coming together, even though when they're getting together in these meetings, there's a Confederate flag on the wall, and then, you have, which is obviously a very hurtful symbol for a lot of black people in America. And so to have black revolutionaries to come into a meeting and then see that on the wall, how do you make that work? How do you bring together these people who feel as though, you can talk about the indigenous peoples of the United States who are, to see that, it's just a painful, hurtful kind of thing. But they all came together. And they formed a coalition, this rainbow coalition. And so, you can argue, indigenous peoples will say America should not even be a thing. But it did not stop them from getting together and working with one another. And what they did is they built this coalition. Eventually, over time, what happened was that if you can think of it as sort of like a crucible, in the crucible of like struggle, these disparate parts are put in the crucible, and through common struggle, you get this amalgamation of the future of whatever we're gonna call the United States tomorrow. But you don't make that a precondition to coming together. And so if you go back to even in 1985, Adulis, EPLF published in Adulis, its publication, quarterly, I believe it was, its position on Ethiopian movements, democratic movements in Ethiopia. And one of the things that they said was that, on the one hand, you have the ethnic nationalist. And their problem was that they could, if you were going from one region to another and engaging in warfare with the oppressor and the enemy, the Derg at the time, it was like turf wars. And they couldn't, there was an inability to form a common front, a united front to fight. So that was one problem. This other thing was that on the other side, you had, like you're saying, this imperialist, there was the Amhara chauvinism at the time, which is a big issue. And so what then happened was that, in various movements, they would say we're all about Ethiopia, but then they had this chauvinism there, this ethnic chauvinism. And so, so these two different sides, how do you reconcile the two? What do you do? And so what they argued for was a united front that actually believed in a common Ethiopia, but free of the chauvinism. And so the question then is it impossible to have a situation where the chauvinism is going to be there? And the thing is that, and I like to use the term Ethio-pessimism, honestly, the idea that, that this is impossible, I think is, it goes against socialist ideas and socialist internationalism and solidarity of the working and exploited around the world. And so we should be able to get together, and then if at the end of the day, self-determination or whatever issue it is something that has to be addressed, that can be addressed. But you don't unilaterally say we are breaking apart from this historic, current state. And the other thing is we have to also go back to 1964 with the Cairo Declaration. With the Cairo Declaration, this is the Cairo Declaration of the Organization of African Unity, which is today the AU. What they said was that because of colonialism, we're going to have to accept the borders that exist as is. So we're going to have to accept the borders as is. And so all of these borders were colonial manifestations. So Ethiopia, surrounded by all these different colonial countries, its borders are also therefore colonial. And so the idea was that all these, we have to, whether we like it or not, Ethiopia is Ethiopia, Eritrea is Eritrea, Somalia is Somalia. The entire Africa in 1964 declared that this is, we have no choice because they're all imaginary borders. And in fact, like Benedict Anderson said in his famous book, a nation is an imagined community. So, so it's very important to understand it. And so when we talk about, Ethiopia is, a nation of nations, they're all of them are imagined communities. So the question is, can we form a basis of solidarity to work together? And so how do you know if you haven't even tried? And so the thing is now Abiy Ahmed is saying that this is something, an Oromo, by the way, who is saying that this is something that can, saying it's the first non-ethnicity-based government. And so all we know is what is actually done in practice. And so in practice, I won't be the judge of it, but I think the Ethiopian people and the peoples of the Horn will be the judge of it. Has he done that? I'll leave it to people to believe in that. And we'll see if people buy in or not.
Well, I don't know if either of our two panelists on Zoom wanted to address the first question that was on the floor. I think Dr. Hassan, I think Elias is motioning to you to address it.
Yeah, go ahead, Mohammed. The situation of the Tigrayan peasants, what do we do to assure them is, I think, a very relevant question of the young lady. You have addressed it previously, but if you could go at length.
Before I talk about that, I think we have to see one new element on the US strategy on the African continent. Comparatively, the relationship between China, and most of African countries is smoother, because China, it has the money. When now you look at the activity of American diplomacy in the African continent, most of American ambassadors are talking to African politicians not to deal with China. I met a former Kenyan Foreign Office, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he told me that he will have breakfast with the American ambassador in Nairobi. After 2 days, I met him. I said, "How it was your breakfast?" He said, "I stayed with him for about 5 hours, and the man is non-stop is telling me, we Kenyans, we should not work with China. But, and what did you say to him?" He said, "Well, I told him, you are 50 years in Kenya, but you didn't even build one toilet. Why we don't work with China? United States doesn't have money. It have only empty mouth. They just come and they tell you don't work with China. At least if they have a check in their pocket, you could talk to them. But they don't have. They are bankrupt. They only frighten you and they tell you will stop your assistance and so on. They have been in Kenya for 50 years. The railway is built by Chinese. Several projects in Kenya is built by Chinese. When you look to the neo-colonial bourgeoisie, African neo-colonial bourgeoisie in African continent, and you talk to them, they tell you what, United States, when you wanted to have a visa, it will take you 6 years. But if you wanted to make business with Chinese, you can go straight in Beijing, and then even they will bring for you a translator there in your own language, whether you speak Hausa or Fulani or Kukuyu or whatever it is. I think in that sense, it is Chinese comparatively are winning the game because of this weakness of the United States and even Europeans, and this Eurocentrism they have developed for the last 6 decades, the way they are treating Africans, businessmen and businesswomen. These have created for them, they became, in fact, it became now a negative, that it is nobody goes to them. They go to China and they go to Turkey. Turkey even is passing them in a fastest rate. There are millions of African business people, men and women, go to Turkey. So there is a very serious problem in United States. So I think the strategy of United States, in order to put a stone in the shoes of Chinese, the Kosovo option. Kosovo is a very good option in a way that you make sure that that country will not have stability and there will be an internal war. In that sense, that also Chinese cannot come and deal with these African countries. I think that is, as the Arabs, they say, lo ma tanfa dur. If you cannot help, make them pain. Probably one of their assumptions is for Kosovo to take a Kosovo option for Tigray. The other part yes, in Ethiopia there was a fundamental nationality question in the past. Ethiopian state, it is built on a serious majority of the population had been marginalized. Ethiopians, in real sense, they were Amharas and Tigrays, and these Coptic religion believers. Majority of the Muslims in Ethiopia, they were no citizens until in 1976. They mobilized the demonstration. Secondly, that the history of Ethiopia, if you take the history of the Somali region, it came to Ethiopia, it was given as a gift by the British to Haile Selassie in 1948. The first step, and the second is in 1954. That is why when we say that the project of the new Horn of Africa will solve all these problems, it means that it is. In fact, the Somalis, they are in the vanguard of creating the new Horn of Africa. If we build the highways and railways between the Somalis in Ethiopia and the Somalis in Somalia, in Kenya, and so on, that the Somali market will be wider and so on, and you deal also with the other Ethiopian nationalities also within Ethiopia, the market will be very high. So in fact, the new Horn of Africa will resolve all these contradictions. To come to the lady, what is Tigray, first of all? That have to be defined very clearly. Tigray, administratively, as we know it, in the past, it is a very small region. That region, it combines Tigrinya speakers, Kunama, Afars, and Saho. But the TPLF expanded it. And if you look into their document in the 80s and so on, you see the only region which is grown more than 40%, it grew is only Tigray, like a plastic, elastic. The biggest mistake for the TPLF is that when they took language is the only factor which unifies you. If I am a peasant and I live in an area and that peasant market is closer for me, the Tigrinya speaker peasant majority, and I come every week or every month to make my shopping and so on in that, or to sell my goat or chicken or whatever it is, I have to speak the language of the market, because if I have a rabbit, I have to sell it with the language of the majority of the population. So I will learn Tigrinya. It doesn't mean because I speak Tigrinya that I'm a Tigrayan. The Walkite, they speak Tigrinya, they speak Amharic, and they speak Arabic, those who are making business with Sudan. If you only take one variable, language only, then you are making a very wrong conclusion. And that is what TPLF's major mistake. They have everybody who is speaking Tigrinya, they say it is a Tigrayan. And from that perspective, they deny the existence of Eritreans. So they nationalize a segment of Eritrean who speak Tigrinya as if they are there, with them. But I'm living in Belgium. In Belgium, there is two languages spoken. There is a Dutch speakers and there is a French speakers. Our neighbor is the Netherlands. They speak also Dutch. But if you take only the language as a factor, then is the Flemish, who are the majority in Belgium, 6 million, and the Dutch people, who are 14 million, they are supposed to be in one state. But the psychological makeup of the Dutch people is totally different from the psychological makeup of the Flemish. The Flemish, they feel more Belgian, even though they share language with the Dutch. So dialectically, if you are not handling the issue carefully, you make a very serious crisis, and you bring also the nationality who are born from, like Tigray, they brought the Tigrayans in a very serious crisis. Now we, the Ethiopians, and the people of the region, there is a historical responsibility from us. One, all these crimes who are committed by TPLF is not committed by the people of Tigray. The people of Tigray, they are #1 victims before other Ethiopians. In their name, this mafia group, this fascist group, used the name of people of Tigray, looted, killed, and so on, and accumulated a crime. Therefore, we Ethiopians, in specific, who are non-Tigrayans, we have to open our hand and discuss with our brothers and sisters Tigrayans. Without Tigray, it is not possible to build a new Horn of Africa. Without Tigray, it is not possible to build a new Ethiopia. Minus TPLF, we have to raise the consciousness of all the Ethiopian people that in criminal organization, we have to minus that the people of Tigray, they have to join. Of course, they have succeeded, they have nationalized the people of the Tigray, they intoxicate them very much and so on. It will be very hard, but we non-Tigrayans, we have to be very careful, we have to be very dialectical, we have to be very democratic. That is, if we wanted to defeat the far enemy, we have to make sure the unity in our house must be very strong. So from this point of view, we have to go a big mile. I'm sorry, your friends here now, those who you invited me, I wish you had invited Tigrayans who are living in the United States of Tigrinya Americans. You could have debated with them openly, honestly. You could facilitate for us. I will be available if you can organize whatever ideas they have, Tigrayans. We can discuss with them openly, and we can, because we need them. They are our brothers and sisters. The enemy always looks division, and we have to try more unity in order to defeat the enemy. This is my opinion.
Yeah, I would like to add in that regard, something maybe the audience in New York can relate to. You're not far from Harlem, and I will take you back to 1963, a meeting of two great minds in Harlem, the great African revolutionary thinker, Abdurrahman Muhammad Babu from Tanzania, and of course, the great African-American revolutionary of his time, Malcolm X. Babu had a great influence in radicalizing Malcolm from that narrow nationalist, perspective of a racialist view into, forming alliance about solidarity with the oppressed, going to Africa and talking about African revolution. In fact, some say it was Babu who introduced Malcolm into Frantz Fanon's writings. The Riches of the Earth was published by that time, I think, and I think that had a profound effect on Malcolm. Now, why am I bringing Babu, Abdurrahman Muhammad Babu? Because he was also a great friend of the Eritrean revolution. He went to liberated area in Eritrea under the EPLF to examine for himself whether the rhetoric of the political writings of the EPLF he was hearing in England, I mean in the UK where he was based, coincided with the reality on the ground. So he wanted to see whether this was an authentic revolutionary movement. You know what, in 1985 he stayed there like a month and a half and under difficult war conditions. In the end, when he came out, he wrote a long article in a magazine. And its lead sentence said, "Here in Eritrea, I have seen the future of Africa and it works." Now, some thought that that was, too hyperbolic, too exaggerated. Why did Babu say that? The reason was something more than the EPLF's military capacity. He realized the EPLF was a great fighting force. It had a great liberation army and was capable eventually of winning, winning on the military front. But beyond that, he also was impressed with the politics of the EPLF. One of the things he saw there was that the EPLF managed to educate or raise the political consciousness of captured Ethiopian soldiers from oppressed nationalities. So I saw that these POWs then voluntarily joined the revolutionary army of the EPLF. Not only that, but many fell in battle. Many married Eritrean women. I know a person, for example, who is now living in Ethiopia. He's of Oromo ethnicity. But his wife is an Eritrean fighter of the EPLF. They have now 4-5 children together. He speaks fluent English, fluent Tigrinya. He was a political commissar of the EPLF. And he has written a book of his experience. I think it's these kinds of things that Babu saw, the revolutionary potential of the EPLF, not being bogged down in nationalism, but being able to think beyond the pitfalls of nationalism, to use the famous term of Frantz Fanon in his book, chapter 3 of The Wretched of the Earth. You know, he speaks at length about the pitfalls of national consciousness. What did he mean by that? Well, nationalism or nation statism is not the end. We have to go beyond that. We have to think in terms of across borders, breaking down ethnic barriers, talking about larger Pan-African unity, going down, beyond neocolonialism or the neocolonial comprador bourgeoisie, which wants division along borders. The neocolonial comprador bourgeoisie wants to maintain nation statism, to divide peoples along borders, along ethnic lines, religious lines, tribalism, and what have you, because they are not real national bourgeoisie in the real sense. They are not captains of industry. They're proxies or compradors of imperialism, messengers, errand boys and errand girls. That's all they are. So they can't think in broader terms of revolutionary terms, uniting the people, creating people-to-people solidarity. I think the EPLF early on, during the days of its struggle, much like Fanon, much like Cabral, saw these kinds of potentialities. And while it was struggling, it continued to educate its fighters and the masses that independence is not the end of our objective. It's not the end of our goal. Waving the flag and being a member of the United Nations, that's not the end. That's the mere beginning of the struggle. The struggle has to go beyond that to form solidarity with the peoples of Ethiopia, with the peoples of Sudan, and to see what we are talking about, the new Horn of Africa. So when Muhammad and I talk about the new Horn of Africa, it's this kind of revolutionary ideals and ideology that backs it. And if you address the issue from this perspective of the new Horn of Africa, the question of the oppressed Tigrayan peasantry, yes, they are oppressed, they are suffering, then automatically is addressed as the question of the oppressed Amhara peasantry, as the question of the oppressed Oromo peasantry. So you see solidarity across ethnic divides, across religious divides, across tribes, and what have you. And you see greater potentialities which made Abdurrahman Muhammad Babu to say, here in Eritrea, I have seen the future of Africa and it works. And I don't think he was exaggerating. I'm committed to this kind of idea. So is my comrade Muhammad, who is Somali from Ethiopia. And I think this is what imperialism tries to prevent. I hope I've not taken much time, but it is a point worth emphasizing, and I'm glad the young lady asked this question. We have to emphasize the oppressed peasantry of Tigray are our brothers and sisters, and we have to see beyond the demise of the TPLF into embracing them in this greater new Horn of Africa, that they are part of this new Horn of Africa, and all issues that face them, be they climatic, be they underdevelopment, and what have you, must be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate both those answers. We're like an hour and 20 minutes over time, which is okay. I think we took the appropriate amount of time, but I do want to respect the staff, who is not actually rushing us out of here, which shows that the People's Forum is the type of place we want to be. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean we can't have revolutionary discipline, high morale. That's how it's done. I want to take this final question though in the back, someone who has not spoken. So let's just take that real quick, and then I'm going to ask Simon to make some final comments. But I think we will also put our heads together, Simon and I, and figure out how we can recreate more events and more spaces, because there's obviously a lot to discuss and a lot to say. So let's just not consider this the end, but just consider it the beginning, the end of the beginning. How about that? But yes, in the back here, please feel free. We're going to bring a mic to you, so just give us 1 second.
Yes, hello. So I just wanted to know that about 2 days ago, there was a coup in, I'm probably going to pronounce it wrong, but Guinea, a country in Africa.
Yeah, Guinea.
And I wanted to know, so obviously it was backed by the US and through the CIA and also Europe and through AFRICOM. I wanted to know what is the significance of Guinea to the US and or to Europe? What do they get out of orchestrating the coup and installing a coup regime?
I think that's a great question. I'll just take chair's prerogative and address it really quickly. But it is an important one. And as Elias very, very graciously mentioned earlier on Breakthrough News, we did have on our live stream on Thursday, Kambali Musavoli, who addressed this question at length if you want to know a little bit more. But, Guinea is a deeply mineral-rich country, bauxite, iron, several other very important minerals going back for some time. I think it's important to remember here that Guinea was the first country in Africa to be like truly, truly independent in the sense that they had no sort of, that had not been already colonized. So that's sort of a preface. But in terms of West Africa, of countries that had been colonized, it was the first one to become sort of truly independent, that they had no sort of prior arrangement with imperialism. And the French, when they left, they even pulled the phones out of the government offices because they wanted to do everything they could to hobble the government, because it is one of the richest countries. Sekou Touré is from Guinea, so it's one of the countries that developed some of the early anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, anti-neo-colonial thought. Of course, it was a country that was the place that Kwame Nkrumah retreated to after the coup there. So just a little bit of history, I think, about Guinea. But truly, I think really what is here, and I think similar to our conversation that we've been having about the Horn, is this new power struggle on the African continent between the United States, Western Europe, and areas that want Africa to remain essentially colonized in a neo-colonial position, but in a position where they have these, it's minerals, not food, but let's just call them monocrop economies, where the only role that they can play is to export certain raw materials for multinational corporations, not based in those countries, but in the United States, Australia, Canada and Australia especially, also Switzerland, other nations like that. to sell on the world market and make all the money at the end of the day. And ultimately, when you look at a country like Guinea, which has a $12 billion contract with China in order to exploit the iron there, there is a possibility, and I think what is behind the coup is the fear of the slipping away. And this is, you look at Mali, which has also been in a similar situation where, thousands of people rose up last year and trashed all the French businesses to show that they're against neocolonialism. Burkina Faso, which had a youth uprising several years ago. Cote d'Ivoire, where people rose up just last year, although no one really heard about it, again, against French imperialism. That there is, I think, a deep fear inside of the US and Western establishment. This is why they've set up, it's like a secret military base in Ghana, really. They don't talk about it, but they have this giant section of the airport in Accra that is actually now like a military-only zone where the US is flying in and no one knows exactly what's going on, but there are a lot of special forces there. That inside of West Africa, because the states themselves are so incredibly weak. I mean, and it's they have big militaries, they have guns, but they have no real support. And that the possibility of them to just simply be wiped away is not only very significant, but the other piece of that is you have countries like China, but not just China, Vietnam, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, and others who are willing to sort of work with whoever wants to work with them in order to push forward their economy, that these countries could not only slip out of the political control of the United States, but slip out of the economic orbit of Western Europe in particular. And to a lesser extent, that's also what's important to the United States, not just their own companies, but making sure Europe continues to be able to make money in a way that allows them to keep the Western European alliance. The Wolfowitz Doctrine in 1991 that determined how the US essentially operates around the globe explicitly said the worst place for us to lose is Western Europe, because that'll mean a split in the world that'll make it impossible for us to dominate every single other region. So I think that's a little bit of what's behind the coup in Guinea. I think there's a little bit more to it, but really this great power game where there are people all around the world who are fed up with neocolonialism, especially in Africa, and now they have more development options to be able to leverage the great power conflict happening all around the world to become more independent and more free. And certainly that's a worst case scenario for the multinationals that don't benefit from that. But I appreciate the question. So real quick, just to close out, I just like to ask Simon to maybe just offer a few pieces here, and thank you again for helping us put this together. Executive Director of the New Afrika Institute, Simon Tesfamariam, close us out.
Eugene really knows his stuff, doesn't he? I mentioned earlier the Rainbow Coalition, Black Panther Party, and how important and crucial that was. So similarly, I think right now in the Horn of Africa, when we're talking about the new Horn of Africa, which has been articulated so well with comrades Elias and Muhammad, they, by the way, you should check out Horn of Africa TV, wonderful programs on there in different languages. And so if you can check out the one that best caters to you, I think you'd learn, everybody here would learn a lot from that. But the new Horn of Africa, I think right now, I mentioned the problem, everybody here has mentioned the problem of sectarianism and how, tribalism or, religious movements, fringe movements are dividing the people, and that, imperialism finds these local managers, these puppets, to divide and conquer. And so in order to combat that, we need to be able to come together as a block, as a resistant block that will resist empire. And so I think we need to talk about, like the Rainbow Coalition, building a Horn of Africa coalition. And this would then, and it's not just the Horn of Africa, this is a part of the, Africa and the broader world, and plugging into different organizations. When we're talking about the Horn of Africa, I think keeping it simple, these three things: the anti-sectarianism, one, being anti-war or peace, however you want to phrase that, number two, and number three, economic integration, working towards the development of the Horn. Hard-wiring relationships with pipelines, railroads, trade and commerce and currency, all that kind of stuff. So we need to start thinking in that type of direction and building now. Because what happens after TPLF? TPLF is just the flavor of the day today. And so they're going to, when they're gone, we have to start thinking of, we have to prevent against the next TPLF. But I don't want to think in terms of a negative, to be against TPLF or against this group, but instead to be unity. I think who is it? We've heard it a couple times. It was Eugene. Unity. We need unity. And so in some parts of, in Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, thinking of the idea of unity scares some people. And, obviously there's this, some people have used the term unity as a way of kind of, colonizing folks and all that kind of stuff. And so it does bring some fears that, is this going to happen again? But that was yesterday, and we need to start thinking about the future. And when we say unity, it's with with respect of among the different nations and different groups and all that stuff. What I think right now moving forward is we need to start talking about coalition building in the Horn of Africa and forming a unified, I don't want to say unified front, that's a technical language, but we need a coalition right now of the Horn of Africa in terms of naming and all that stuff. We can talk about that some other time, but I believe that we need to start thinking about that moving forward.
Right on. Well, thank you, Simon. Another round of applause for Simon, Elias Amare, Dr. Muhammad Hassan, to the friends and comrades who fed us, gave us sustenance. I think a special thank you as well to the People's Forum is very well deserved. I think a lot of places would have been afraid to put this event on. So we're very thankful to folks here at TPF. And like I said, Simon and I will keep talking and putting our heads together for how we can do more, continue to bring in more voices, continue to discuss, and continue to find ways to push this forward. Obviously, there are many, many events here at the People's Forum, so I encourage you to check out, not only everything here, but upcoming things. There's so many fantastic things. Someone told me there might be a sign-up sheet for the Answer Coalition in the front. That person left. So, yep, it's right there at the front desk. So if you want to be able to sign up to get more updates from the Answer Coalition, you can sign up at the front desk as well. But I think that will bring this event to a close. And special thanks to all of you for attending, everyone here online. Thank you so much. Thank you again, and looking forward to the future. Yep. Go.
Thank you so much for this wonderful women here.
One more round of applause, please.
For the coffee, the food, everything. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.